September morning in Dawson County, eastern Montana, and the sun came up the way it had for 100 years before Robert Decker was born, and would for 100 years after he was gone. The light spilled across 840 acres of wheat stubble, golden remnants of a harvest 3 weeks finished, and touched the Absaroka Mountains 60 miles west with colors that had no names in any language men spoke. Deck stood in the doorway of his equipment barn at 5:30 in the morning, coffee mug in one hand, the other resting against the frame where his grandfather's initials were still carved in the wood from 1923. The air smelled like diesel and dust, and autumn coming on fast the way it always did in this part of Montana, where summer lasted about 6 weeks if you were lucky, and winter took the rest. The John Deere 8450 combine sat 20 feet away. Green paint faded to something closer to sage in the places where sun and weather had worked on it for 12 years. Deck had bought it used in 1979 for $45,000, which seemed like all the money in the world at the time, and it had cut wheat on this land every September since. Last week he'd pulled the header off and greased every fitting, changed the oil and filters, checked the belts and chains and bearings the way his father had taught him and his father's father had taught him. Everything in order, everything ready for next year. Except Deck wasn't sure there would be a next year, at least not with a Decker running this operation. The sound of tires on gravel pulled his attention to the driveway. A black Lincoln Town car, the kind that cost more than most people in Dawson County made in 2 years, rolled past the house and parked near the barn. Deck recognized it. He'd seen it twice before in the past 4 months, and each time it brought the same man with the same proposition and the same smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Kenneth Ashford stepped out of the Lincoln wearing a suit that probably cost $800 and shoes that had never seen a working day in their existence. He was 45, trim, hair going silver at the temples in that way that made men look distinguished in boardrooms and ridiculous on farms. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no about anything that mattered. Behind him came a second man, younger, 30 maybe, also in a suit, carrying a folder the size of a phone book. Lawyer, Deck figured. They always brought lawyers. "Morning, Mr. Decker." Kenneth Ashford's voice carried across the space between them, smooth and practiced. "Beautiful day." Deck sipped his coffee and waited. He'd learned a long time ago that the man who spoke first usually lost whatever negotiation came after. Ashford walked closer, the lawyer following like a shadow. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I know you're busy getting ready for winter operations." "Didn't say I'd meet with you." Deck's voice came out flat, no hostility but no warmth either. "You showed up." "Fair enough." Ashford stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk but not close enough to crowd. "I'll be direct because I respect your time. Western Prairie Consolidated has been acquiring agricultural properties in Dawson County for the past 18 months. We're building a consolidated operation that will span 15,000 acres when completed. Your property is essential to that plan." He gestured toward the fields, the barn, the equipment, like he was already seeing it as his. "We've made you 2 previous offers. Both generous, both rejected. I'm here today to present a final offer that I believe addresses any concerns you might have had about valuation." The lawyer opened the folder and pulled out a document, walked forward and handed it to Deck. Deck took it but didn't look at it yet. $2.1 million. Ashford let the number hang in the air like it should mean something more than it did. "That's $2,500 per acre, Mr. Decker. The market rate in Dawson County is $950 per acre. We're offering you more than double market value." Deck looked at the paper now. The numbers were printed clean and official, columns of figures that added up to more money than his father had seen in 40 years of farming this land. More money than Deck had made in 30 years since taking over in 1961, when his father's heart gave out at age 63, pulling a stuck plow out of mud. Plus full market value for all equipment and structures. Ashford continued, warming to his pitch. That's another $300,000 minimum. You walk away with $2.4 million in total, free and clear. No debt, no stress, no more fighting weather and markets and equipment breakdowns. You'd be set for the rest of your life. Deck folded the paper once, then again, creasing it with his thumbnail. I already told you twice I'm not interested. Mr. Decker, I understand family farms have sentimental value, but sentiment doesn't pay bills. Your land is surrounded by properties we've already acquired. Tom Fletcher sold us his 680 acres in July. Harold Simmons sold us 520 acres in August. Rita Kowalski sold her 440 acres 3 weeks ago. Ashford stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that tried to sound like concern but came across as condescension. You're going to be an 840-acre island in the middle of our 15,000-acre operation. We'll control the grain elevators. We'll control the equipment dealerships. We'll control the seed suppliers and fertilizer distributors. Every business relationship you depend on will run through us. He paused to let that sink in. This offer expires December 31st. After that, you'll still be surrounded, but you won't have the premium we're offering today. Take the money, Mr. Decker. Retire. Enjoy your grandchildren. Let the next generation worry about agriculture. Deck looked past Ashford to the wheat fields his great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1887. The land had been virgin prairie then, never touched by a plow, grass that grew tall enough to hide a horse. His great-grandfather had broken it with a team of oxen and a plow that took 3 men to manage, working dawn to dark for 2 years before the first wheat crop went in. His grandfather had bought the first tractor in 1919, expanded the operation to 400 acres. His father had doubled that, brought in the first combine, started the cattle operation. Deck had maintained it, improved it, fought for every acre through droughts and recessions and banks that wanted to foreclose 3 different times. 104 years, 4 generations, all of it about to become a line item on a corporate spreadsheet managed from an office in Chicago by people who'd never touched dirt. Not interested, Deck handed the paper back to the lawyer. Ashford's smile finally dropped. You're making a mistake. Probably made 100 mistakes farming this land. One more won't kill me. This offer is final, Mr. Decker. We're not coming back with a better one. Good, don't come back at all. Ashford stared at him for a long moment, the way a man stares when he's trying to decide if anger or pity is the right response. He settled on something in between. Your stubbornness is going to cost you everything. Already cost me everything that mattered. Deck turned back toward the barn. My wife died 18 months ago. My son moved to Seattle and doesn't want anything to do with farming. I'm 58 years old with diabetes from Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam, and the VA tells me I've got maybe 10 years if I'm lucky. So you tell me, Mr. Ashford, what exactly do I have left to lose? He walked into the barn without waiting for an answer. Behind him, he heard car doors slam, engine start, gravel crunching under tires as the Lincoln turned around and headed back to the county road. Deck set his coffee mug on the workbench and stood there in the dim light filtering through gaps in the barn siding, hands on his hips, breathing slow and deliberate the way the VA counselor had taught him to manage stress. His heart was doing something irregular in his chest, skipping beats, racing then slowing. He'd felt it before, knew it was partly the diabetes and partly just being 58 years old and angry about things he couldn't control. The phone in the barn office rang. Deck walked over, picked up the receiver that still had grease stains on it from 1974. Dad. Kyle. His son's voice carried across 1,000 miles from Seattle, flat and tired even at 7:30 in the morning Pacific time. Morning, Deck kept his voice neutral, waiting. I got a call from Kenneth Ashford. He said you refused their offer again. That's right. Silence on the line, the kind that stretched out when two people had already had this conversation 6 times and knew exactly how it would go but had to have it again anyway because neither one could let it rest. Dad, it's $2.1 million. That's generational wealth. You could retire, move closer to Sarah and the grandkids, stop killing yourself out there. Deck looked through the office window at the fields beyond. This land is your generation's wealth. It's been Decker land for 104 years. I don't want it, Dad. I've told you that. I'm a civil engineer. I make $90,000 a year. I have a life here. Sarah has her physical therapy practice. The kids are in good schools. So when I die, what happens to this place? Sell it, take the money. Use it for something that actually matters. The words hit harder than Deck expected. He sat down in the desk chair that creaked under his weight, the same chair his father had sat in for 40 years. This is what matters, Kyle. Food production matters. Family legacy matters. Independence from corporations that want to turn farming into factory work matters. Dad, family farms are dying. Western Prairie is right about that. You can't compete with their economies of scale. They've got GPS-guided tractors, commodity futures contracts, vertical integration from seed to distribution. You're fighting a war you can't win. Maybe, but I'm fighting it anyway. Another silence. Deck could hear traffic in the background on Kyle's end, city sounds, the world his son had chosen instead of the one Deck had built for him. The offer expires December 31st. Kyle's voice had shifted to something that sounded like patience but felt like condescension. That's 3 months. Think about it, please. I already thought about it. Answer's no. Then I don't know what else to say. Don't have to say anything. Dex stood up, ready to end this. Just wanted you to know someone offered me more money than this farm is worth, and I told them to go to hell. Thought you should hear it from me. He hung up before Kyle could respond. The barn felt emptier after that. Dex stood in the silence, listening to his own breathing, feeling the weight of 58 years and 104 years, and all the years that would come after he was gone pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Linda would have known what to do. She always knew what to do. When the bank threatened foreclosure in 1982, she'd been the one who found the loophole in the loan documents that bought them another 6 months. When Deck's father died in 1961, and Deck was only 28 years old and terrified he'd lose everything, Linda had been the one who told him he was stronger than he thought. When Kyle decided to go to engineering school instead of ag school, Linda had been the one who convinced Deck to support it, to let their son choose his own path even if it hurt. She'd been gone 18 months now. Cancer had taken her the way it took too many people who'd lived their whole lives around agricultural chemicals before anyone knew what those chemicals did to human cells over time. Deck had watched her shrink from 130 pounds to 90, watched her hair fall out from the chemo that didn't work, watched her die in a hospital bed in Billings while machines beeped and nurses whispered, and nothing anyone did made any difference. The last thing she'd said to him, 3 hours before she stopped breathing, was this: "Don't let them take the farm. Fight for it." He'd promised her he would. That had been 18 months ago, and he'd kept the promise so far, but he didn't know how much longer he could keep it. His A1C was 9.2, which the VA doctor said was heading toward kidney failure. His blood pressure was 140/95 even with medication. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. the kind of tired that came from fighting battles you couldn't win against enemies you couldn't see. But Linda had made him promise, so he'd fight until he couldn't fight anymore. 260 miles east in Glendive, Montana, in a third-floor apartment that smelled like old cooking and heating that didn't work right, Beth Morgan sat at a kitchen table counting money for the third time in an hour like the numbers would change if she just kept trying. $67. 3 20s, 1 5 and 2 1 spread across Formica that had a cigarette burn from some previous tenant and a coffee stain that wouldn't come out no matter how much Beth scrubbed. $67 between her family and the street. Rent was due in 9 days, $440 that she didn't have and had no way of getting. The landlord had already given her an extension in August when Marcus's death benefits got delayed in VA processing hell. There wouldn't be another extension. Mr. Peterson had made that clear when he taped the notice to her door 3 weeks ago, his face apologetic but firm. Business was business. Beth looked at her kids sitting across from her at the same table. Jackson was 13, tall for his age, wearing a t-shirt with a hole in the collar and jeans that were 2 inches too short because he'd grown 3 inches since school started, and there was no money for new clothes. Emma was 10, small and quiet, pushing Cheerios around in a bowl with a spoon, the milk thin and watery because Beth had stretched a half-gallon to last 4 days instead of 2. "Can we have eggs?" Jackson asked, looking at the cereal with something close to disgust. "Not today, baby." Beth's voice came out more tired than she wanted it to. "Tomorrow, maybe." The lie tasted worse than the cereal looked. Tomorrow she'd have $67 or less, depending on whether the Ford Ranger needed gas to get to another interview she wouldn't get. There wouldn't be eggs tomorrow or the day after or the day after that. Emma looked up with brown eyes that held the kind of trust that broke Beth's heart every single time she saw it. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" "We're going to be fine, sweetie." Beth smiled, and the smile was another lie stacked on top of all the others. "Mommy's got interviews this week. Something's going to work out." Jackson knew better. He was 13 and he'd watched his mother go through 6 interviews in the past 2 weeks and come home each time with the same defeated expression she was wearing right now. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said enough. Beth had been a combat medic in Desert Storm, Army, 1991. She'd worked 20-hour shifts in field hospitals treating everything from shrapnel wounds to heat exhaustion to the kind of trauma that came from watching your friends die 50 feet away. She'd saved lives. She'd held men while they bled out because there wasn't enough plasma and the helicopters couldn't get through the sandstorm. She'd come home with an honorable discharge and a chest full of medals, and the assumption that her country would take care of her the way she'd taken care of soldiers in the desert. That assumption had been wrong. She'd met Marcus Morgan in 1992 at a VA support group for Desert Storm veterans trying to adjust to civilian life. He'd been a combat engineer, quiet and kind, and struggling with the same questions she was about what came next after war. They'd married in 1993. Jackson came in 1994, Emma in 1997. Marcus worked construction and Beth worked as a nurse's aide at Glendive Community Hospital, and between them, they made enough to get by. Then 2003, Iraq War. Marcus re-enlisted because the Army called and he believed in serving, and the money was better than construction. He deployed in April, promised he'd be home by Christmas. In September, an IED hit his convoy outside Fallujah and turned him into a casualty number that showed up on the news ticker at the bottom of CNN. The death benefits had sustained them for a while. $60,000 over 8 years, plus housing assistance, plus Marcus's GI Bill transferred to the kids for college someday. It wasn't wealth, but it was survival. Then the bureaucracy happened. The VA changed some regulation about benefit renewals. The paperwork got lost. The caseworker who'd handled their file retired and the new caseworker didn't know their case. The appeals process took months. The money stopped coming in June, and here it was September, and Bate had $67 and 2 kids who needed to eat. She'd applied for jobs, 6 of them in 2 weeks. Glendive Community Hospital, RN position, $18 an hour. She had the experience, but her nursing license had lapsed because the renewal fee was $800, and she didn't have $800. Application rejected. Dawson County Medical Clinic medical assistant, $14 an hour. The manager had been sympathetic but firm. We're looking for candidates with current clinical experience. You've been out of healthcare for 6 months. Ranch supply store cashier, $9 an hour. The owner had taken one look at her and said, "We need someone with retail background. Computer skills. You'd be starting from zero." The truck stop on Highway 16, waitress, $7 an hour plus tips. The manager had been more direct. "I'm looking for younger servers, honey. Someone who can handle the long shifts and the trucker crowd." The school district bus driver, $12 an hour. Sounds good until they mentioned the CDL requirement and the $1,200 training course she'd need to take before they could hire her. The grain elevator, office clerk, $11 an hour. That one had hurt the most because she'd gotten all the way through the interview before they asked about computer skills, and she'd had to admit she didn't know Microsoft Office or Excel or any of the systems they used because she'd been working manual labor and raising kids for the past 10 years, and technology had moved on without her. 6 rejections. 6 different variations of "you're not qualified, you're not current, you're not what we need." Bates stared at the $67 and felt something dark and desperate rising in her chest, the kind of feeling that made people do things they'd regret later. She could steal. She could beg. She could walk into the welfare office and subject herself to the humiliation of proving she was poor enough to deserve help. She could call Marcus's parents in Billings and ask for money even though they'd blamed her for his death, told her at the funeral that if she'd been a better wife, he wouldn't have re-enlisted. Or she could keep trying. The Ford Ranger was 17 years old and burned oil, and the transmission slipped between second and third, but it still ran. She had a quarter tank of gas, enough to make it to Billings and back if she was careful. She needed to go to the VA office anyway. The caseworker had told her to check in weekly about the benefits appeal. It was a 90-mile drive each way, 3 hours total, but maybe this time they'd have an answer. Bates stood up from the table. Jackson and Emma watched her with the kind of silence that kids develop when they know their parent is holding on by a thread, and any noise might snap it. "I'm going to Billings." Bates' voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Patterson next door is going to watch you. I'll be back by dinner." She kissed them both, grabbed her purse with the $67 and her VA card and the job applications she'd printed at the library, and walked out into September heat that was already pushing 90, even though it was only 9 in the morning. The VA office in Billings was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and despair. Bates sat in a plastic chair for 45 minutes before a caseworker named Jennifer called her name. Jennifer was 30, maybe 35, wearing business casual and an expression that said she'd had this conversation 1,000 times, and it never got easier. She pulled up Bates' file on a computer that looked like it was running Windows 95. "Mrs. Morgan." Her voice was sympathetic, but there was nothing behind the sympathy except process. "I see you're here about the benefits renewal appeal." "Yes." Bate leaned forward, hands clasped, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. "It's been 3 months. I was told the appeal would take 6 weeks maximum. Jennifer clicked through screens, reading, I understand. Unfortunately, your case has been flagged for additional verification. What does that mean? It means the system is requiring additional documentation to confirm your late husband's service record and death benefits eligibility. He died in Fallujah. Bates' voice went hard. There are news articles about it, official casualty reports. His death certificate has Department of Defense stamps all over it. What additional verification do you need? I understand your frustration. Jennifer's tone stayed professional, which somehow made it worse. The system has certain requirements. I don't make the rules, I just process the cases. How long? Another 4 to 6 weeks minimum. Bate felt something break inside her chest. I don't have 4 to 6 weeks. I have $67. My rent is due in 9 days. My son needs asthma medication that costs $85. I can't wait another 4 to 6 weeks. Jennifer looked at her with eyes that had seen this exact situation play out too many times to count. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan. I truly am. But the system is what it is. I served in Desert Storm. Bates' voice cracked. My husband died in Iraq. We were promised we'd be taken care of. I know, and you will be, once the appeal processes. Bates stood up. She didn't trust herself to say anything else. If she stayed in that chair another 30 seconds, she'd start crying or screaming, and neither one would change anything. She walked out of the VA office, down 3 flights of stairs because she couldn't stand the thought of waiting for an elevator, and out into Billings heat that felt like standing too close to an oven. The Ford Ranger was parked 2 blocks away. She walked to it in a daze, got in, sat behind the wheel with both hands gripping it hard enough that her knuckles went white. 4 to 6 weeks. She'd be evicted in 9 days. Jackson and Emma would be homeless, sleeping in the truck if she was lucky, a shelter if she wasn't. Everything Marcus had died for, everything she'd fought for, all of it circling the drain because some bureaucrat in a VA office couldn't process paperwork fast enough. Bate put her forehead against the steering wheel and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. That was all she allowed. 2 minutes of breaking down, and then she had to put it back together because her kids were depending on her, and soldiers didn't quit their posts no matter how bad things got. At 2 minutes and 5 seconds, she lifted her head, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and saw the bulletin board through the windshield. It was mounted on the wall outside a coffee shop, covered in the usual small-town debris. Garage sales, lost cats, church bake sales, used furniture for sale. And in the bottom right corner, handwritten on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook, one small piece of paper that said, Ranch Help Needed. Decker Farm, County Road 335, Dawson County. Bates stared at it. She didn't know anything about ranching, didn't know cattle from horses, couldn't tell a tractor from a combine, had never been on a farm except for one field trip in elementary school 25 years ago. But $67 wouldn't last 9 days, and every door she'd knocked on had closed in her face, and she had 2 kids who needed a mother who didn't give up. She got out of the truck, walked to the bulletin board, and wrote down the address. County Road 335 was 15 miles east of Glendive, a gravel road that ran straight as a rifle shot through wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The land was flat except where irrigation pivots created geometric circles of green against brown stubble, and the sky was so big it made Bate feel small in a way she hadn't felt since standing in the desert in Saudi Arabia, watching F-15s fly overhead toward Baghdad. The Ford Ranger rattled over washboard gravel, throwing up dust in a plume behind it. Bate followed the mailbox numbers painted on fence posts until she saw 335 and a wooden sign that read Decker Farm Est 1887. She turned in. The driveway was a quarter-mile long, passing a white two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and black shutters, then curving past red barns and silver grain bins and equipment sheds that looked like they'd been there since the Depression. Everything was maintained but not fancy, functional rather than pretty, the kind of place where people worked instead of posed for photographs. Bate parked near the largest barn and killed the engine. It died with a sound like a mechanical cough, something in the exhaust system giving up. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, trying to find courage she didn't feel. This was stupid. She had no experience, no qualifications, no reason to think whoever owned this place would give her a job when 6 other employers had already said no. But $67, 9 days, 2 kids. She got out of the truck. The barn door was open, and she could hear someone working inside, metal on metal, the sound of a wrench turning a bolt. Bate walked toward it, her shoes crunching on gravel that had probably been laid down before she was born. Inside the barn it was cooler, dim light filtering through gaps in the siding, and she could see a man bent over a piece of equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie, if science fiction movies were set on farms. He was tall, 58 maybe, gray hair, wearing a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up and jeans that had grease stains older than Emma. He looked up when her shadow fell across his work. "Help you." His voice was rough, used to giving orders more than asking questions, but not unkind. "I'm here about the job." Bate heard her own voice and realized she'd unconsciously shifted into the tone she'd used in the Army, direct and professional. The ranch help position. The man straightened, set down his wrench and looked at her with eyes that were either blue or gray depending on the light. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just assessed her the way a person assesses livestock at auction, taking in details. City clothes, office shoes, soft hands, wrong everything. "You know anything about wheat farming?" "No, sir." "Cattle?" "No, sir." "Equipment?" "No, sir." The man wiped his hands on a rag that might have been red once, but was now mostly the color of motor oil. "Then, why are you applying for ranch work?" "Because I need a job." Bate felt something breaking loose inside her, the professional tone cracking. "I've applied at 6 places in the past 2 weeks. Every single one turned me down. I don't have experience in retail or healthcare or driving or office work or anything else that pays money apparently. But I'm a hard worker and I learn fast and I need this job more than I can explain." The man studied her face. "You prior service?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, sir. Army, 91 Bravo Combat Medic, Desert Storm 1991, honorable discharge." Something shifted in the man's expression, subtle but real. "Marines. Vietnam 68 to 69. What's your name?" "Beth Morgan." "Robert Decker. Most people call me Deck." He extended his hand and Bate shook it. His grip was calloused, strong, the handshake of someone who'd worked with his hands for 6 decades. "Follow me." Deck walked out of the barn and Bate followed, not sure what was happening but too committed to stop now. He led her to the farmhouse, up the porch steps, and into a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something that might have been breakfast 3 hours ago. "Sit." Bate sat at a kitchen table that looked like it had been there since 1950. Deck poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove, set one in front of her, sat down across from her with the other. "Tell me about yourself." Bate wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. The heat felt good even though it was 90 degrees outside. "I was born in Great Falls, joined the Army after high school, did my tour in Desert Storm, came home, worked as a nurse's aide, Met my husband at a VA support group, Marcus Morgan, combat engineer. We had 2 kids. He re-enlisted in 2003. Died in Fallujah that same year. Her voice stayed steady through most of it, broke a little at the end. VA death benefits kept us going for a while. Then the paperwork got screwed up and the money stopped. I've been trying to get it fixed for 3 months. Meanwhile, I had to leave my job at the hospital because I couldn't afford the nursing license renewal. I've applied for 6 jobs in 2 weeks, all rejected because I don't have the right qualifications. She paused, decided to say the rest because what did she have to lose? I have $67. My rent is $440 and it's due in 9 days. My son has asthma and his medication costs $85. I'm out of options. Dex sipped his coffee, said nothing. Bate kept going. I don't know anything about farming, never been on a ranch in my life, but I was a combat medic. I worked 20-hour shifts in field hospitals. I treated gunshot wounds and shrapnel and third-degree burns. I can handle hard work. I can follow orders. I can learn. She leaned forward, everything in her posture screaming desperation. If you give me a chance, I will not let you down. That's not a promise, that's a guarantee. Dex set his coffee mug down. The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall that looked like it had been there as long as the table. Mrs. Morgan. His voice was measured, thoughtful. Farming isn't about quitting or not quitting. It's about what you're willing to fight for. When harvest comes and you're working 20-hour days and equipment breaks at midnight and cattle get sick and wheat prices crash and nothing goes the way you planned, what's going to keep you fighting? Bate didn't hesitate. My kids. They're watching to see if their mom can provide for them. I won't let them watch me fail. Dex studied her for a long moment. Bate met his eyes and didn't look away. Okay, $8 an hour, 50 hours a week. That's $400 a week, $1,600 a month. Start tomorrow morning, 5:30 a.m. Wear work boots and warm clothes. Bates' brain took several seconds to process what he just said. You're hiring me. I'm giving you a chance. Whether you succeed or fail is up to you. Thank you, Bates' voice cracked. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. Dex stood up, walked to the sink, rinsed his coffee mug. You're going to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. This isn't the army where someone tells you exactly what to do every minute. You're going to have to think, adapt, solve problems. You're going to make mistakes and I'm going to expect you to learn from them. He turned back to look at her. But I remember what it was like coming home from Vietnam. 21 years old with no job prospects and no one willing to hire a veteran because they all thought we were damaged goods. Someone gave me a chance. My wife's father hired me on his farm even though I didn't know wheat from barley. He paused, so I'm giving you the same chance. Don't make me regret it. I won't. Bates stood up, felt tears forming but forced them back because soldiers didn't cry in front of superior officers. I won't let you down. 5:30 tomorrow morning. Don't be late. Bate drove back to Glendive with $400 a week running through her head like a prayer. $1,600 a month. Minus rent that was $1,160. Minus food maybe $400. Still left $760 for everything else. Jackson's medication. Emma's school supplies, gas, utilities. Maybe even saving a little for the first time in 8 months. She could breathe again. That night she told Jackson and Emma over dinner. Spaghetti with sauce from a jar because that's what $67 bought. She watched their faces light up like 4th of July fireworks. You have a job. Emma's voice went high with excitement. I have a job. What kind of job? Jackson was more cautious, 13 years old and suspicious of good news. Farming. I'm going to learn to be a farmer. Jackson looked skeptical. You don't know how to farm. Not yet, but I will. That weekend Bates spent $42 at the Goodwill in Glendive. Work boots, $11, brown leather, scuffed but solid. 2 pairs of men's jeans, $9 each because women's work pants cost more and she couldn't afford the difference. 3 work shirts, $7 total, faded flannel that had been washed so many times the colors looked sun-bleached. Work gloves, canvas with leather palms, $6. She had $25 left. Bought milk, real milk and bread and peanut butter and apples. Jackson and Emma drank the milk like it was Christmas morning. Sunday night Bate laid out her work clothes, boots by the door, jeans and flannel shirt on the chair, set her alarm for 4:45 a.m. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too nervous to sleep. What if she couldn't do it? What if Deck realized his mistake on day 1 and fired her? What if she really was too weak, too inexperienced, too wrong for this? But $25 wouldn't pay rent, and 2 kids needed their mother to not give up, and a Marine veteran had given her a chance when no one else would. So she'd fight. That's what soldiers did. They fought. Monday morning, September 23, 1991, 4:45 a.m. Bate, dressed in the dark, drove through empty streets to Highway 16, turned east as the sun started painting the horizon orange and pink. Arrived at Decker Farm at 5:28, 2 minutes early. Deck was already working in the equipment barn, doing something with a wrench to something large and mechanical that Bate couldn't identify. He looked up when her headlights swept across the gravel. "You're early. You said don't be late." Deck almost smiled. "Come on, I'll show you around." The first 2 hours were information overload. The machine shed, 40 by 60 feet, concrete floor spotless despite decades of tractors and repairs. Tools organized on pegboards, every wrench and socket in its place, parts shelves labeled. Deck explaining everything in a voice that expected her to remember. Organization saves time. Everything has a place. When you use something, put it back where it belongs. Understand? Yes, sir. The barn next. Red paint, white trim, hay loft above, equipment storage below. He showed her the grain bins, 3 of them, silver cylinders tall as 3-story buildings. Explained moisture content and spoilage and aeration systems and bushel weights. Bate took mental notes, trying to absorb information that felt like drinking from a fire hose. Your first task. Deck pointed to a workbench covered in tools and parts and general chaos. Clean and organize that. Then sweep the machine shed floor. Simple work but important. Shows me you pay attention to detail. Bate worked for 8 hours straight. Her hands blistered from gripping the broom and lifting unfamiliar tools. Back ached from bending and reaching, but she finished. Tool bench spotless. Tools sorted by size and type. Floor swept clean enough to eat off. She found Deck in the barn at 5 p.m., working on something involving cattle and hay, and a trailer she didn't understand yet. Finished. Deck walked back to the machine shed with her, inspected the workbench, running his hand along the surface, checked the floor, nodded. Good work, same time tomorrow. That night Bate collapsed on her couch, body screaming. Hands blistered despite the gloves, back hurting, shoulders tight, but she'd done it. Day 1 didn't quit. Tuesday, day 2, Deck brought out a tractor. John Deere 4440. Green paint faded in places. Older model, manual transmission, diesel engine that coughed blue smoke when it started. This is where you learn. Clutch in, shift to first, throttle here, let the clutch out slow. Bate tried, stalled. Engine died with a jerk that rattled her teeth. Again, stalled, 3rd time, 4th, 5th, 6th. A man appeared from the barn. Older, 60 maybe, watched Bate stall for the 7th time, shook his head. said something to another worker that made them both laugh. Bates' face burned with humiliation, but she tried again. Seventh attempt. The tractor lurched forward, jerky and rough, but moving. By noon, she could drive it around the yard without stalling. By 4 p.m., she backed it into the shed, tight fit, sweating but successful. Deck watched from the barn door, didn't praise but didn't criticize. "You're picking this up faster than I expected. Most people quit after day 2. I told you I wouldn't quit." "People say that, if you mean it, you mean it." Wednesday, day 3, backing grain wagons. Hardest skill Bate had encountered yet. Wagons didn't turn like cars. You steered opposite of instinct. Push the wheel left to make the trailer go right. Brain screamed pull, but hands had to push. Bate jackknifed a wagon twice, nearly hit the barn door once. Deck grabbed the wheel. "Easy, you're learning." The man from yesterday, the one who'd laughed, watched from across the yard, shook his head again, muttered something about wasting time. Bate caught the words cost him money, pretended she didn't hear. By end of day, she could back wagons competently, not perfect but functional. Her confidence grew in tiny increments. Maybe she could do this. Maybe. Thursday, day 4. Equipment maintenance. Oil changes, filter replacements, grease points. Deck showed her how to pump grease into fittings, explaining that each tractor had 70 to 90 zerks that needed regular servicing. Bates' hands cramped from squeezing the grease gun. Blisters formed on top of yesterday's blisters. She wrapped them in band-aids and kept working. But something happened that afternoon. Deck noticed it first. "You've got good hands for mechanical work. Natural feel for how things fit together." Bate looked up from the oil filter she was removing. "Really?" "Some people have it, some don't. You do." Something shifted in Bates' chest. Pride maybe. Competence. She'd never thought of herself as mechanical, never had reason to, but watching an engine come together, understanding how parts connected, feeling the satisfaction when something clicked into place correctly, it felt right. Natural. Like finding a language she didn't know she spoke. Friday, day 5. Deck drove Bate out in his pickup truck, Ford F-250 that smelled like diesel and old leather. They walked through wheat stubble from the harvest 3 weeks finished. "This is what you'll be working with come spring." Deck bent down, picked up a handful of soil. Sandy loam. Drains fast, warms up early. Good for early planting. He walked 20 feet, picked up another handful. "This section's clay. Holds moisture, slower to warm. You adjust planting depth and fertilizer based on soil type." "Why not just plant everything the same?" "Because the land's not the same. Treating it all alike means some sections produce half what they should. Farming is about paying attention, seeing differences, adjusting." Bate asked questions. "Why not wheat every year? How do you know when to plant? What about fertilizer timing?" Deck answered each one, patient, thorough. Bate realized she was thinking like a farmer already, considering variables, planning ahead, connecting cause to effect across seasons. That evening, Friday, Bate drove home in the dying light. Body ached everywhere. Hands blistered and raw, back screaming, shoulders tight, but she'd done it. 5 days, 40 hours, first paycheck coming next Friday, $400. Rent would be late, but she could pay it. Food would be on the table, milk in the refrigerator. Jackson and Emma asking for seconds instead of pretending to be full when they weren't. She collapsed on the couch. Jackson came over, sat next to her. "How was your week, Mom?" "Hard." Bates' voice came out exhausted. "Really hard, but good." Emma climbed up on her other side. "Are you still a farmer?" "I'm learning to be one, sweetie." That night after the kids went to bed, Bates started a notebook, spiral bound, 50 cents at the drugstore. She wrote down everything Deck had taught her. tractor controls, grease point locations, soil types, oil change intervals. Studied it before bed like cramming for a test that mattered more than any test she'd taken in school. This was her chance. The one Deck had given her when she'd had $67 and no options. She wouldn't waste it, wouldn't quit when it got hard, would prove that a combat medic from Great Falls could become a farmer in eastern Montana if she wanted it badly enough. 9 days ago, she'd had $67 and 6 rejections, and 2 kids watching to see if their mother could survive. Now she had $400 coming, and a job and a future that looked possible instead of impossible. All because one Marine had asked the right question and believed her answer. What are you willing to fight for? She'd said her kids. But it was bigger than that now. She was fighting for herself too, for the chance to build something, for the right to prove that experience mattered less than determination, for the opportunity to show her kids that when the world knocks you down, you get back up and you keep fighting until you win or you die trying. Decker had given her that chance. She wouldn't let him down. October came to Dawson County the way it always did, with frost that painted the wheat stubble white before dawn and wind that came down from Canada carrying the smell of winter on its breath. Beth had been working at Decker Farm for 3 weeks, and her hands had finally stopped bleeding. The blisters had hardened into calluses that made her grip on tools feel natural instead of painful, and her back had stopped screaming every morning when she rolled out of bed at 4:30 to make the drive from Glendive in darkness. She was learning, not just the mechanics of farming but the rhythm of it, the way seasons dictated everything, and weather trumped all human plans. Deck taught her to read the sky the way he'd learned from his father who'd learned from his father before that. High thin clouds meant rain in 3 days. Mares' tails meant wind. Red sky at morning meant sailors take warning and farmers should finish whatever field work they had planned because afternoon would bring weather that kept equipment in the barn. The coffee shop at the grain elevator in Glendive was where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings, the way they'd gathered for 60 years, sitting at tables that wobbled and drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the Eisenhower administration. Beth went there with Deck on the first Saturday in October, following him into a room that went quiet when she walked in behind him. 12 men, all of them older than 50, all of them watching the woman in work clothes who didn't belong in their space. Deck ignored the silence, walked to an empty table, sat down. Beth sat across from him and felt eyes on her like physical weight. The waitress brought coffee without being asked, knew what Deck wanted without him saying anything. Black, no sugar, hot enough to strip paint. She set cups down and her eyes flicked to Beth with something between curiosity and judgment before she walked away. Deck sipped his coffee and Beth did the same, waiting, watching, learning this ritual the way she'd learned everything else about farming. You didn't speak first. You listened. You waited to be invited into conversations that had been happening since before you were born. Tom Fletcher approached their table first. He was 68, weathered face carved deep by 70 years of Montana sun, wearing a cap that advertised Pioneer seed corn. He'd farmed land north of Deck's operation for 40 years until 3 weeks ago. Deck, his voice carried something apologetic in it. Tom. Fletcher pulled out a chair, sat down heavy like a man carrying weight that wasn't physical. I heard you turned down Western Prairie's offer again. That's right. Fletcher looked at his coffee cup instead of at Deck. They came to me in July, offered me $1.3 million for 680 acres. That's $1,900 per acre, Deck, double what the land's worth. I couldn't say no. My wife needs surgery. Her hip's been bad for 3 years and Medicare doesn't cover half of it. My son's working construction in Billings, barely making rent. That money gives me a retirement and helps him get started. Deck nodded. I understand. Do you? Because I feel like I just sold out. Sold out to the people trying to kill everything we built. You did what you had to do for your family. Can't fault a man for that. Fletcher's hands were shaking slightly around his coffee cup, old man tremors or guilt or both. Harold Simmons sold too, 520 acres in August. And Rita Kowalski, her husband died 2 years ago and she couldn't work the land alone. 440 acres 3 weeks ago. They paid her almost $2 million. He looked up now, met Deck's eyes. You know what that means? You're surrounded. Western Prairie owns every farm touching your property line. 14,200 acres all around you like a noose. Bate watched Deck's face and saw nothing change. No anger, no fear, just the same steady calm he'd shown when teaching her to drive the tractor or explaining soil moisture content. Then I guess I'm surrounded. They're not going to stop, Deck. Fletcher's voice dropped lower, urgent. Kenneth Ashford told me they're building the largest consolidated wheat operation in eastern Montana. 15,000 acres when it's done. GPS-guided everything, commodity futures contracts, processing facility in Miles City. They've got capital from Chicago investors. You can't compete with that. Don't have to compete. Just have to keep farming my land the way I've always farmed it. For how long? Fletcher leaned forward. You're 59, your health isn't great. Kyle doesn't want the farm. What happens in 5 years when you can't do this anymore? Deck set his coffee cup down with a sound that was louder than it needed to be. That's 5 years from now. Today I'm farming. Tomorrow I'll be farming. That's all I need to worry about. Fletcher stood up, the conversation over because there was nothing left to say. Both men had made their choices, and those choices put them on different sides of something bigger than either of them. He walked away without saying goodbye. Bate waited until they were in Deck's truck heading back to the farm before she spoke. Is it true? Are you really surrounded? Yep. And they own the grain elevators. 2 out of 3 in Dawson County. The third is an independent, but he does most of his business with Western Prairie. They've got leverage over him. What about equipment dealers? Western Prairie has controlling interest in the Case IH dealership in Glendive and the John Deere dealer in Miles City. They don't own them outright, but they own enough stock to influence decisions. Bate processed this, understanding dawning like cold water. They're going to make it impossible for you to operate. That's the plan. So why not take the money? $2.1 million is life-changing. Deck drove in silence for a mile, watching wheat fields pass by on both sides, land that had been broken by his great-grandfather's plow in 1887, when Montana was barely a state. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but harder than Bate had ever heard it. Because if I sell, Western Prairie controls food production from here to North Dakota. Every farm that holds out gives other farmers courage to hold out. Every farm that sells makes it easier for them to pressure the next one. This isn't about me or my retirement or my comfort. It's about whether family farming survives another generation or whether corporations turn agriculture into factory work run by people who have never touched dirt. He glanced at her. You asked what I'm willing to fight for. This is what I'm willing to fight for. Bate understood then that this wasn't just a job. This was a war, and she'd enlisted on the side that was outnumbered and outgunned and fighting for something that most people had already given up on. The education continued through October and November. Deck taught Bate the wheat farming cycle from beginning to end, walking her through operations that wouldn't happen for months but needed to be understood now. Winter wheat got planted in late September, went dormant under snow, then exploded into growth when spring came. Spring wheat got planted in April or May depending on soil temperature and moisture. Both varieties had different market values, different protein contents, different uses in the food system. He showed her the equipment she'd be operating come spring. The John Deere 7700 grain drill that planted seed in precisely spaced rows at precisely calibrated depths. The Brandt 4000 air seeder that could cover 80 acres in a day when conditions were right. The Case IH sprayer with booms that extended 50 feet on either side, applying fertilizer or pesticides in patterns controlled by computers that hadn't existed when Deck's father farmed this land. Bate learned maintenance schedules, oil changes every 100 hours, grease points serviced weekly during heavy use, hydraulic fluid monitored for metal contamination that indicated seal failure, air filters checked daily during dusty conditions. The complexity overwhelmed her at first, hundreds of details that seemed impossible to remember, but Deck broke it down into systems, and suddenly it made sense the way field medicine had made sense once she understood triage protocols. The cattle operation was different from crops, more immediate and personal. 200 head of Angus cattle that needed daily attention even in winter. Deck showed her how to check for illness, looking for animals that stood separate from the herd or showed labored breathing or had discharge from eyes or nose. He taught her to recognize the subtle signs of impending calving, the restlessness and isolation that meant a cow would drop her calf within 24 hours. Bate worked with the cattle in November when the first real cold hit and temperatures dropped to 15 degrees at night. She learned to break ice on water tanks with a sledgehammer, the impact jarring her shoulders until they ached. She learned to fork hay from the loft down to the feeding area, each bale weighing 60 pounds, and her throwing them like she was back in basic training doing sandbag exercises. She learned to move cattle from one pasture to another, using nothing but patience and body position. No yelling or waving arms, just walking slowly and letting the herd flow around her like water around a stone. The work was physical in a way that combat medicine had never been. In the army, she'd worked brutal hours but mostly standing in one place, treating patients as they came to her. Farming was constant movement, lifting and carrying and climbing and walking, 10 miles a day on foot just doing routine checks, then another 5 on equipment when she started learning to operate the larger tractors. Her body changed. The soft places hardened. Weight dropped off until her jeans from the Goodwill got loose, and she had to buy a belt to keep them up. Muscles appeared in her arms and shoulders and back, the kind of lean strength that came from functional work rather than a gym. Jackson noticed at Thanksgiving when she reached across the table for potatoes, and her forearm showed definition that hadn't been there in September. "Mom, you're ripped." Bate looked at her arm like she was seeing it for the first time. "I guess carrying hay bales will do that." Emma wanted to know if she could come to the farm and see the cows. Bate promised she would bring her out once winter really set in, and school had Christmas break. Deck had already said it was fine, told Bate to bring the kids anytime, show them where their mother worked and what she did. Maybe Jackson would want to learn equipment operation. Maybe Emma would discover she loved animals the way some kids did. The veteran network formed organically. Bate met Carl Jensen at the Grain Elevator coffee shop in mid-November, a Saturday morning when she'd gone with Deck again, and sat at the same wobbly table drinking the same terrible coffee. Carl was 64, Korea veteran, still farming 720 acres of wheat and barley 15 miles north of the Decker operation. He'd noticed Bate the previous time but hadn't approached. This time he walked over carrying his coffee and a newspaper folded to the commodity prices page. "You're the one Deck hired, combat medic, Desert Storm." Bate stood up the way she'd been trained to stand when a senior NCO addressed her. "Yes, sir." "Sit down, you're not in the Army anymore." Carl pulled out a chair. "My son was Army, Iraq, First Gulf War, same as you. came home with his head screwed up. PTSD they call it now. Back in Korea, we just called it shell shock and told each other to get over it. He couldn't work for 2 years. Finally got into a program at the VA that helped. Now he's teaching high school in Billings. Doing okay. He sipped his coffee and looked at Bate with eyes that had seen things she recognized. How are you managing? VA treating you right? No, sir. My husband died in Fallujah. Death benefits got hung up in bureaucracy. That's why I needed the job. Carl nodded like this confirmed something he already suspected. VA's been screwing veterans since before there was a VA. They'll process paperwork for tanks and missiles same day, but take 6 months to approve benefits for a widow. Systems broken. He set his coffee down and his voice shifted to something more businesslike. There's 5 of us in Dawson County, veterans who farm or ranch. Me, Deck, Tom Anderson, who runs cattle south of Glendive, Richard Moss, who has sheep operation west of here, and now you. We look out for each other. Equipment breaks down and dealer can't get parts. We share what we have. Weather turns bad during harvest. We help each other finish before it snows. One of us gets sick. The others cover until he's back on his feet. Carl pulled a business card from his wallet, handed it to Bate. That's my number. You ever need anything, call. Deck's too proud to ask for help most times, but he'll accept it if it's offered right. You're working for him, that makes you part of the network. Bate took the card, felt something shift. She'd been alone since Marcus died, fighting battles by herself because there was no one else to fight them with. Now suddenly there were people, veterans who understood what it meant to serve and what it meant to keep fighting when the fight seemed impossible. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Carl stood up. This thing with Western Prairie is going to get worse before it gets better. They've bought out 3 farms in 4 months. They're not stopping. We're going to need every person willing to stand up to them. Winter came hard in December, temperatures dropping below 0 and staying there for 2 weeks straight. Bate learned to plug in the engine block heaters on tractors every night so they'd start in the morning. She learned to dress in layers, thermal underwear and flannel shirts and insulated coveralls, and a jacket that was probably older than she was but kept her warm even when wind hit 30 miles per hour out of the north. The work slowed but didn't stop. Equipment maintenance filled the short daylight hours. Deck showed Bate how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, how to replace worn bearings in a planter, how to troubleshoot electrical problems that made no sense until you understood the circuit diagrams. They worked in the machine shed with a space heater running and country music playing from a radio that picked up one station clearly and 2 others that faded in and out depending on atmospheric conditions. Deck talked while they worked, teaching not just mechanics but philosophy. Farming is mistakes. Everyone makes them. Difference between good farmers and bad farmers is good farmers learn from mistakes and bad farmers repeat them until they go broke. You plant too early and a late frost kills the crop. You learn. Next year you wait. You apply too much fertilizer and burn the seed. You learn. Next year you cut the rate. Equipment breaks because you didn't maintain it properly. You learn. Next year you're more careful. Bate asked questions constantly. Why this hydraulic fluid instead of that one? Why service intervals at 50 hours instead of 100? Why replace this part before it fails instead of waiting? Deck answered every question with patience that surprised her because most men his age dismissed questions from women as either stupid or unnecessary. But Deck treated her like he'd treat any farmhand who wanted to learn, explaining until she understood, and then making her do it herself while he watched to ensure she did it right. Christmas came and Bate took 3 days off, the first time she'd missed work since starting in September. She spent it with Jackson and Emma in the apartment in Glendive that no longer felt like a trap, because she could pay rent now and buy groceries, and even had $200 in savings that she was building slowly towards something that felt like security. They put up a small tree from the lot on 3rd Street. Bate bought presents she could actually afford instead of garage sale items wrapped in newspaper. Jackson got new basketball shoes he'd been wanting. Emma got art supplies and 3 books from the series she loved. They ate turkey breast from the grocery store deli and mashed potatoes from a box and cranberry sauce from a can. And it was the best meal any of them had eaten in a year, because it came from money Bate had earned instead of benefits that arrived uncertain and late. On Christmas night after the kids went to bed, Bate sat at the kitchen table with the notebook where she kept track of farm operations and wrote down everything Deck had taught her in the past 3 months. 96 pages of notes. Tractor operation, equipment maintenance, soil science, cattle health, crop rotation theory, market analysis, weather prediction. She'd learned more in 3 months than she'd learned in 4 years of high school. And she'd proven something to herself, that she could do hard things. That inexperience didn't mean incompetence. That determination mattered more than background. That a combat medic from Great Falls could become a farmer if she wanted it badly enough. January brought new challenges. Deck's diabetes got worse, his blood sugar spiking to 300 despite medication, and the VA doctor told him bluntly that his kidneys were showing early signs of failure. Cut the stress, or you're looking at dialysis in 3 years. Deck ignored the advice the way he ignored most advice that involved slowing down. But his body didn't ignore it. Bate noticed he was moving slower, taking longer to do tasks that used to take him 20 minutes. Getting out of the truck required effort. Climbing into the tractor seat left him breathing hard. He tried to hide it, but Bate had been a medic long enough to recognize the signs of a man pushing past his physical limits. She started taking on more responsibility without being asked. Handled the morning cattle check alone so Deck could sleep an extra hour. Did the heavy lifting in the machine shed, moving parts and equipment that weighed more than she did. Took on the planning work, reviewing next spring's seed orders and fertilizer applications and equipment scheduling. Deck noticed. February morning, both of them in the machine shed replacing bearings on the grain drill. He stopped working and looked at her straight on. You're managing this operation, and I'm just supervising. Bate kept her hands on the bearing press. That's not true. It is true, and it's what needs to happen. I'm promoting you to farm manager. $12 an hour plus 10% of net profit. You make decisions on day-to-day operations. I'll handle big picture strategy and financial planning. That work for you? Bates' hands stopped moving. Farm manager. That was a title. That was responsibility. That was trust on a level she hadn't expected after only 5 months. Yes, sir, that works. Then it's done. Starting now, you run the morning operations. I'll be here by 8 to check in and handle anything that needs my attention. But you're in charge of equipment, cattle, and crew once we hire seasonal workers for spring planting. Spring arrived in March with mud season. The ground thawed and turned to black paste that clung to everything, boots and truck tires and tractor wheels accumulating mud until you had to scrape it off with a shovel. Deck began planning for spring planting, ordering seed and fertilizer and scheduling equipment maintenance that had to happen before field work started. That's when the first real problem hit. The John Deere 4440 tractor was 30 years old, reliable but showing its age. The transmission was slipping between second and third gear, a problem that would only get worse under the heavy load of planting season. Deck needed to replace it before April or risk a breakdown that would delay planting and cost him yield. He drove to Miles City on a Tuesday in mid-March, Bate riding along to learn equipment purchasing. The John Deere dealership was a sprawling operation with new tractors lined up out front like soldiers on parade, green paint gleaming, price tags that made Bates' eyes water. $200,000 for a new 8R Series tractor with GPS and automatic steering, and every bell and whistle John Deere could bolt on. Deck wasn't looking at new. He was looking at used. Found a 2005 model 7720 with 12,000 hours on it, well-maintained, priced at $45,000. Fair price for what it was. He'd checked the engine, the transmission, the hydraulics, everything solid. The salesman was maybe 35, wearing a polo shirt with the John Deere logo and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Name was Brad something. Bate didn't catch the last name. He pulled up Deck's account on his computer, typed for a minute, then looked up with an expression that had shifted from friendly to uncomfortable. "Mr. Decker, I'm showing your account is flagged for credit review. I can't approve financing without regional manager approval." Deck's face stayed neutral. "I've been buying equipment from this dealership for 30 years. Never missed a payment. Why would my account be flagged?" Brad typed some more, reading information off the screen. "It shows here that due to changes in your operational status, your credit risk profile has been elevated. I'll need to get my manager." He walked away before Deck could respond. Bate watched him disappear into an office at the back of the showroom. Through the window she could see him on a phone, talking to someone, gesturing. 5 minutes later, he came back with a man in his 50s. Gray hair, tie, the kind of middle management that existed to say no to things without taking responsibility for the decision. "Mr. Decker, I'm Dave Patterson, Regional Credit Manager. I've reviewed your account. Unfortunately, we can't extend financing for this purchase at this time." Deck's voice stayed level, but something cold entered it. "Why not?" "Your farm operation is currently classified as high risk due to regional market volatility. Our lending guidelines require additional collateral or a significant down payment for high-risk accounts." "What additional collateral?" "Another 40% down. You'd need 18,000 down instead of the standard 10%. "That's new policy." Patterson's eyes flicked away. "Implemented last month." Convenient timing. Deck let the words hang there, right after Western Prairie bought controlling interest in this dealership. Patterson's face went red. "I don't know what you're implying, but our lending decisions are based solely on risk assessment and corporate policy. Your corporate policy is designed to squeeze out family farmers who won't sell to Western Prairie." "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Decker, but the decision stands. Without additional collateral, we cannot approve financing." Deck turned and walked out without another word. Bate followed. In the truck, he sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands gripping it hard enough that his knuckles went white. "They're doing this all over, aren't they?" Bates' voice was quiet. "Every dealership, every supplier, every business relationship you need." "Yep, Western Prairie doesn't just want to buy my land. They want to make it impossible for me to farm it." "So what do we do?" Deck started the truck. "We find another way." They drove to Billings, 3 hours west, to an independent dealer that sold used equipment from multiple manufacturers. Smaller operation, family-owned, no corporate connections. The owner was a man named Frank Morrison, 60 years old, mechanic coveralls with oil stains that looked permanent. Deck explained what he needed. Morrison walked him around the lot, showed him 3 tractors in the right price range. They settled on a Massey Ferguson 3680, 15 years old, 8,000 hours, solid mechanics, $38,000. "I can do owner financing if you need it." Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact. 20% down, rest over 4 years at 6% interest. That work? Deck did the math in his head. 7,600 down, 7,900 per year in payments, manageable if the harvest was decent. "Yeah, that works." They shook hands on it. Deck wrote a check for the down payment and made arrangements to pick up the tractor the following week. On the drive back to Dawson County, Bate thought about the $7,600 Deck had just spent. Money he wouldn't have had to spend if the John Deere dealer had approved financing on terms that were standard, until Western Prairie changed them. How many more times can you work around their blocks? Deck kept his eyes on the road. As many times as I have to. But Bate could hear the doubt underneath the determination. Western Prairie had resources Deck didn't have. They could apply pressure at a dozen points simultaneously. Equipment financing, seed suppliers, fertilizer contracts, grain elevator access, marketing channels. Every piece of the farming operation relied on business relationships, and Western Prairie was systematically poisoning those relationships. One man couldn't fight that, not alone. April brought spring planting and the pressure got worse. Deck tried to buy certified wheat seed from the co-op in Glendive, his usual source for the past 20 years. The co-op manager was apologetic but firm. All our certified seed is allocated to Western Prairie contract growers. We don't have surplus for independent operators this year. Deck tried the supplier in Miles City. Same answer. The supplier in Billings. Same answer. Western Prairie had locked up the entire supply chain for certified seed in eastern Montana. Carl Jensen heard about the problem and called a meeting. 5 veteran farmers gathered in his machine shed on a Tuesday evening in mid-April, sitting on hay bales and drinking coffee from a thermos while wind howled outside. Carl, Deck, Bate, Tom Anderson, who ran cattle, and Richard Moss from the sheep operation. Carl laid it out simple. Western Prairie is using their size to control suppliers. They're buying up seed contracts, fertilizer allocations, equipment dealer inventory, making it impossible for independent operators to get what they need. How do we fight that? Tom Anderson was 58, Vietnam vet, hard man with hands scarred from decades of ranch work. We pool resources. Carl pulled out a notepad covered in numbers. I've got 3,000 pounds of certified seed left from last year's order. Good germination rates stored properly. Richard's got 1,800 pounds. Tom's got 1,200. Deck needs 4,500 pounds for his acreage. If we share what we've got, we can cover him. And what do you plant? Deck's voice carried skepticism. You give me your seed, you can't plant your own acres. We've already planted. Carl's voice was firm. Used our allocations early before we realized Western Prairie was going to lock everyone else out. We've got surplus from over-ordering. Rather see it go to someone who will use it than sit in our bins. Deck looked at the 4 men sitting in the shed with him. Veterans who'd served in 3 different wars across 4 decades, now fighting a different kind of battle against an enemy that wore suits instead of uniforms. I can't pay market rate. Money's tight after buying the Massey Ferguson. Carl waved that away. Pay us in wheat at harvest. Bushel for bushel, whatever the market price is in September. That way we're invested in your success. You do well, we do well. That's not business, that's charity. That's community. Carl stood up, walked to the shed door, looked out at darkness falling across wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. Western Prairie wants to turn farming into corporate work, where every decision gets made in a boardroom in Chicago. They want efficiency and consolidation and profit margins. We're fighting for something different. We're fighting to keep this a place where a man can own his land and make his own choices and pass something on to his kids. He turned back. You're the last holdout with significant acreage in Dawson County. If you fall, we all fall eventually, so we're not letting you fall. The seed sharing happened the next day. 3 trucks pulled up to Decker Farm carrying certified hard red spring wheat seed in bags that weighed 50 pounds each. Carl, Richard and Tom unloaded them into Deck's seed bins while Bate coordinated storage and ran inventory counts. 4,500 pounds total, enough to plant all 840 acres. Deck tried to thank them. Carl cut him off. Save it for harvest. Just grow good wheat and prove these corporate bastards wrong. Bate watched the trucks drive away and understood something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just Deck fighting Western Prairie anymore. This was a network of veterans who decided that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were stacked against them. May brought planting season and Bate ran the operation. Deck supervised, but she made the calls on when to plant which fields based on soil temperature and moisture content. She operated the John Deere 7700 drill, planting wheat in precisely spaced rows at precisely calibrated depths, working dawn to dusk for 2 weeks straight while weather held. The work was hypnotic. Drive the tractor pulling the drill across 840 acres in passes that had to be straight and evenly spaced. Watch the monitors that showed seed flow and planting depth. Adjust for changes in soil type and field elevation. Stop every 3 hours to refill the seed bins. Check equipment for problems. Keep going until dark made it impossible to see the field markers. Bate loved it. Loved the solitude of being alone with a machine and a task that had clear metrics of success. Loved the physical exhaustion that came from operating equipment for 12 hours straight. Loved knowing that the work she was doing today would produce food 6 months from now that would feed people she'd never meet. She was a farmer now, not learning to be one, not playing at it, actually doing it. June brought the news that broke Deck's heart worse than any corporate pressure could. Kyle called on a Tuesday evening. Deck was in the farmhouse office doing paperwork, calculating fertilizer costs and loan payments, and trying to make numbers add up to something that wouldn't bankrupt him. The phone rang, and he picked up expecting a supplier or a neighbor or maybe the bank. "Dad, it's Kyle." The voice was tentative, uncertain, the way Kyle's voice got when he knew he was about to deliver bad news. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Actually, something's right. I got a job offer, really good one. I wanted to tell you before you heard it somewhere else." Deck waited, already knowing from his son's tone that whatever came next was going to hurt. Western Prairie Consolidated offered me Regional Operations Manager, Eastern Montana Division. Base salary $140,000 plus performance bonuses. Company truck, benefits, retirement matching. It's an incredible opportunity. Silence on the line. Deck could hear his own breathing, could feel his pulse in his temples, could sense the last piece of his family slipping away. "You're going to work for the company trying to destroy me." "Dad, it's not personal, it's business. Western Prairie is the future of agriculture. Consolidated operations, economies of scale, modern technology. This is where the industry is heading. I'd be stupid to turn it down." "You'd be a traitor to everything this family built." The words came out harder than Deck meant them, but they were true, and there was no taking them back. Kyle's voice went defensive. "I didn't ask to be born into farming. That was your choice, your life. I have a right to choose my own path, and my path is civil engineering and agricultural management. Western Prairie is offering me a chance to use my education at a salary you could never match." Deck stood up from the desk, phone cord stretching tight. "Your great-great-grandfather broke this land with an ox team in 1887. 4 generations of Deckers have farmed this ground, and you're going to help the corporation that wants to erase all of that. I'm trying to build a career and provide for my future family. Why can't you support that?" "Because your career is built on destroying other people's farms, mine included." "Then sell, Dad. Take the $2.1 million. Retire. Stop being so stubborn. Western Prairie is going to win eventually. You're fighting a battle you can't win against an enemy with unlimited resources. All you're doing is making it harder on yourself. Deck closed his eyes, felt something breaking in his chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. Maybe I'm fighting a battle I can't win, but at least I'm fighting. At least I stand for something besides a paycheck. I stand for my future. And I stand for the past 100 years and the future 100 years, and the idea that a man should own his own land and make his own decisions without some corporation in Chicago telling him what to plant and when to harvest and how to live his life. Kyle's voice went cold. Then I guess we don't have anything else to talk about. I guess we don't. The line went dead. Deck stood there holding the receiver, listening to dial tone, feeling like he just lost the last battle that mattered. The farm would go to Kyle eventually. That had always been the plan, but Kyle didn't want it, and now he was actively working for the enemy. Everything Deck had built, everything he'd fought for, would die with him because there was no one to pass it to. He hung up the phone and sat back down at the desk and stared at financial projections that suddenly seemed pointless. What was he fighting for if there was no legacy? What was the point of saving the farm if his own son was helping to destroy it? Bate found him an hour later still sitting in the dark office, staring at nothing. She'd heard enough of the conversation through the walls to know what had happened. She didn't say anything, just pulled up a chair and sat across from him and waited. Finally, Deck spoke. "My son is going to work for Western Prairie. He thinks I'm stubborn and stupid for fighting them. He's probably right." "He's not right." "You don't know that." Bate leaned forward. "I know that what you're fighting for matters. I know that family farms are better than corporate farms because family farms care about land and community and legacy instead of just profit margins. I know that the food system is healthier when it's run by thousands of independent operators instead of 3 giant corporations." She paused, "And I know that sometimes the people we love make choices we don't agree with. That doesn't mean we were wrong. It just means they're on a different path." Deck looked at her with eyes that held 40 years of farming and 59 years of life, and all the weight that came with both. "You really believe we can win this?" Bate thought about $67 and 6 rejections, and 2 kids watching to see if their mother would give up. Thought about Deck asking what she was willing to fight for. Thought about the network of veterans who'd pooled their seed because community mattered more than competition. "I believe we can try, and sometimes trying is enough." Deck nodded slowly, got up from the desk, walked to the window and looked out at 840 acres of wheat that was already 6 inches high, growing strong in June's sun, green shoots that would turn golden by September if weather cooperated and equipment held together, and Western Prairie didn't find some new way to apply pressure. "Then we keep trying." That night Bate drove home to Glendive thinking about the battle they were fighting. Western Prairie had money, power, lawyers, corporate connections, the ability to manipulate entire supply chains. Deck had 840 acres and determination, and a network of 5 veterans who refused to quit. The odds were bad, maybe worse than bad. But Bate had been a combat medic in Desert Storm. She'd worked field hospitals where the odds of saving certain patients were statistically 0, and she'd saved them anyway because giving up wasn't an option. This was the same thing, different battlefield, same principle. You fought until you won or you died trying. And Decker wasn't dead yet. March came to Dawson County, eastern Montana in 1993 with wind that stripped topsoil from fields and carried it east in brown clouds that looked like smoke from distant fires. The snowpack in the Absaroka Mountains was 30% below normal, which meant the rivers and streams that fed irrigation systems would run low come summer. The long-range forecast called for below-average precipitation through June, and every farmer in Dawson County knew what that meant. Drought year. The kind that separated operations with cash reserves from operations that would fold before harvest. Deck stood in a wheat field that should have been showing green shoots by late March, but instead showed patchy germination, brown soil visible between rows where seeds had failed to sprout. He bent down and dug with his fingers until he found a kernel 3 inches below the surface, right where the drill had planted it 6 weeks ago. The seed was swollen but hadn't germinated, waiting for moisture that hadn't come. Another week without rain and it would be too late. The seed would rot in the ground, and this section of the field would stay bare all season. Bate walked the rows beside him, counting germination failures, doing math in her head that added up to bad numbers. They'd planted 840 acres in April. By her count, 340 acres had failed or were failing, over 40% of the crop. The remaining 500 acres showed decent germination, but the plants were stressed, yellow-tinged instead of the deep green they should be, already struggling for water barely a month after emergence. How bad is it? Her voice was quiet, not wanting to make the situation worse by saying it out loud but needing to know. Bad as I've seen since '88. Dex straightened up, his knees making sounds that old knees made, joints that had logged 60 years of wear and weren't designed for the kind of abuse farming required. If we don't get rain in the next 2 weeks, we'll lose half the crop. If we don't get rain by June, we'll lose everything. Can we irrigate? Not enough water in the aquifer to cover 840 acres. Pivot system can handle maybe 200 acres maximum before we drain the well dry. Have to choose which sections to save and let the rest go. Bate looked at the field, calculating which sections had the best soil and the best germination rates, and would give the best return if they concentrated water there. It was triage, the same mental process she'd used in field hospitals deciding which patients got the limited supply of plasma and which ones had to make do with saline. Save who you can save and accept that you can't save everyone. The financial pressure mounted through April and May. Deck's operating loan was $52,000, money he'd borrowed in March to cover seed and fertilizer and equipment repairs, and all the other costs that came before a single dollar of revenue. The loan had a grace period until September when wheat harvest would bring in cash to pay it back. But the bank had included provisions for mid-season review if crop conditions threatened repayment ability. In late May, the letter came from First National Bank of Glendive. Deck opened it at the kitchen table while Bates sat across from him drinking coffee and watching his face change from neutral to hard. What is it? Bank wants $25,000 by end of June. Says drought conditions put the loan at high risk of default, and they need principal reduction to maintain their security position. Can you pay it? Dex set the letter down and pulled out a ledger where he tracked every dollar that came in or went out of the farm operation. His handwriting was precise, numbers in neat columns that told a story of declining cash reserves. Operating account has $18,000. Savings has $9,000. Equipment sale might bring another $3,000 if I can find a buyer for the old grain drill. That gets me to $30,000, but I need $5,000 minimum to keep operations running through harvest. He looked up at Bate. I'm short. Even if I liquidate everything liquid, I'm $5,000 short. And if I drain the accounts completely, I've got no buffer for emergency repairs or unexpected costs. What happens if you can't pay? Bank calls the full loan, demands immediate payment of all $52,000. I can't pay that, so they foreclose, take the farm. Bate felt cold despite the June heat coming through the kitchen window. How long do we have? 30 days. Letter is dated May 20th. Payment due June 20th. That night Bate lay in bed in her apartment in Glendive doing math that wouldn't add up right no matter how many times she tried. She'd been working for Deck for 14 months, making $12 an hour plus 10% of net profit. Except there was no profit this year. There would be no profit. The drought was seeing to that. So her income was $12 times 50 hours per week times 50 weeks so far. $30,000 gross. She'd paid taxes, paid rent, paid for food and gas and Jackson's asthma medication and Emma's school supplies, and all the other costs of keeping 2 kids alive and housed. Her savings account had $4,200, money she'd scraped together one paycheck at a time, building towards something that felt like security. Not enough to make a difference for Deck's problem, not even close. But there was other money. Money she'd been trying not to think about because thinking about it made her feel like she was betraying Marcus's memory. The Ford Ranger was worth maybe $4,000 if she could find a buyer. It was 17 years old and burned oil, and the transmission was dying, but it still ran and someone would buy it. Her VA benefits had finally come through in March after 8 months of appeals and bureaucratic hell. $12,000 in back payments, lump sum that had felt like winning the lottery. She'd put it in a separate account, earmarked for Jackson and Emma's future, college fund or emergency reserve or whatever they needed when they needed it. And there was the life insurance from Marcus's death. $15,000 that she'd never touched, keeping it sacred because it was all she had left of her husband besides 2 kids and memories that got harder to hold on to as years passed. She'd been planning to use it for college, for the kids, for their future. But if Deck lost the farm, Bate lost her job. And if she lost her job, she was back to $67 and 6 rejections and eviction notices. Everything she'd built in 14 months would collapse. Jackson and Emma would suffer not because she'd used Marcus's life insurance to save her job, but because she'd failed to use it when it mattered. She made the decision at 2 in the morning, lying in darkness listening to traffic on the street below and the sound of her own breathing. Got up, turned on the light, pulled out the file where she kept important papers. Found the life insurance account statements and the VA benefits account statements and the title to the Ford Ranger. Added it up. $4,000 for the truck if she got lucky, $12,000 in VA benefits, $15,000 in life insurance. Total $31,000, more than enough to cover Deck's $25,000 payment with room left over. Bates sat at the kitchen table with those numbers in front of her and felt something breaking in her chest. This was Marcus's money, money that had come from his death, money meant for their children. She was about to spend it to save a farm that wasn't even hers. But Deck had given her a chance when she'd had $67 and no options. He'd believed in her when 6 other employers had rejected her. He'd taught her farming and promoted her to manager, and trusted her with an operation worth over $1 million. He treated her like a veteran and a partner instead of like charity or like someone who needed to be handled with pity. She owed him not the money, she owed him the chance to keep fighting. The next morning Bate drove to Billings, stopped at the bank first and withdrew $12,000 from the VA benefits account in a cashier's check made out to Robert Decker. Stopped at the second bank and withdrew $15,000 from the life insurance account in another cashier's check. Stopped at 3 used car lots until she found a dealer who would give her $4,000 cash for the Ford Ranger. No questions asked. Deal done in 20 minutes. She took a cab back to the first car lot where she'd seen a 1987 Toyota pickup for $3,500. Bought it with cash from the Ranger sale. Drove it back to Glendive and then out to Decker Farm, arriving at noon while Deck was in the equipment shed doing maintenance on the combine that would sit idle until September if there was any wheat to harvest. She found him with his hands covered in grease, pulling apart a bearing assembly that needed replacing. He looked up when she walked in, surprised because she normally didn't come back from lunch break. Bate pulled the two cashier's checks from her pocket and set them on the workbench. $27,000. That covers the bank payment with $2,000 left over for operations. Deck looked at the checks like they were written in a foreign language. Where did this come from? Bate kept her voice steady even though her throat was tight. I sold my truck, took out my VA benefits that finally came through, used my late husband's life insurance money. It's enough to keep the bank from foreclosing. Deck picked up the checks, stared at them, set them back down. I can't take your husband's life insurance. That's your kid's future. My kids don't have a future if I don't have a job. You lose this farm, I lose everything I've built in the past year. This isn't charity. This is survival. Deck's voice was rough, emotion underneath it that he was trying to control. This is too much. I can't let you risk your kids' security for my farm. You can and you will. Bate's voice went hard, Marine Corps orders that didn't allow argument. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you this is what's happening. You take this money, pay the bank, keep fighting. When harvest comes and the farm makes money again, you pay me back with interest. If harvest fails and the farm goes under, then we both go under together. But we're not quitting in June because the bank demanded payment we don't have. She turned to leave, stopped at the shed door, looked back. You asked me what I was willing to fight for. I said my kids, but keeping this farm alive is fighting for my kids, because this farm is the only thing standing between them and poverty. So take the damn money and let's get back to work. Deck stood there holding the checks, this 60-year-old Marine who'd fought in Vietnam and built a farm from inheritance and determination, and Bates saw his eyes go wet. He didn't say thank you, didn't need to, just nodded once and put the checks in his shirt pocket. The bank received payment on June 19th, one day before the deadline. The loan officer called Deck personally, surprised. Mr. Decker, I see you've made the required payment. May I ask where you obtained the funds? Deck's voice was flat. That's not your concern. Loan is current, we're done here. He hung up before the loan officer could ask more questions. July brought temperatures over 100 degrees and zero precipitation. The wheat that had germinated struggled under stress that turned the plants from yellow to brown. The irrigation system ran 16 hours a day on the 200 acres Deck had chosen to save, pumping water from an aquifer that dropped 6 inches every week. The other 640 acres went unirrigated, the crop dying slowly under Montana sun that felt like standing too close to a blast furnace. Bate worked those fields anyway, checking for disease or pest damage even though there was no crop left to save. Deck asked her why she bothered. She said because you never know what can survive until it's completely dead. Some of the wheat was hanging on, stunted but alive, root systems reaching deep for moisture that wasn't there but might come if weather broke. It didn't break. August arrived with the same brutal heat and the same cloudless sky. The long-range forecast showed no precipitation through Labor Day. The drought was locked in, settled over eastern Montana like a punishment for sins no one remembered committing. Deck calculated losses: 840 acres planted, 200 acres irrigated and surviving, yield projected at 60% of normal. 640 acres failed or failing, total loss. Even if the irrigated wheat produced well, the total yield would be around 18,000 bushels compared to 32,000 in a normal year. Wheat prices were $3.85 per bushel, up from $3.20 last year because drought was hitting the entire northern plains and driving prices higher through scarcity. 18,000 bushels at $3.85 was $69,300 gross revenue, minus the operating loan of $52,000, minus equipment costs and fuel and repairs. Net profit would be maybe $8,000 if they were lucky. $8,000 for a year of work. Barely enough to cover Bates' salary. Nothing left for deck, nothing for savings, nothing for the next year's operating costs. The farm would survive, but just barely, limping into winter on fumes. But survival was survival. Deck had seen worse. 1988 had been brutal, wheat prices crashed and yields terrible. He'd cleared $4,000 that year and considered it a victory because the bank didn't foreclose. You didn't farm for the good years. You farmed to survive the bad years and hope the good years outnumbered them. September brought harvest and the community showed up. Carl Jensen arrived with his combine and 2 workers from his operation. Richard Moss brought his combine and his son, who was home from college. Tom Anderson brought grain trucks and muscle. 5 operations working together to harvest Deck's 200 acres of surviving wheat before weather turned. They worked 14 days straight, dawn to past midnight when conditions were right. Bate ran the Massey Ferguson tractor pulling a grain cart, shuttling between combines and trucks, coordinating logistics like she'd coordinated medical supplies in Desert Storm. Keep the combines moving, keep the trucks flowing to the elevator, keep everything running smooth because delays cost money and time and they had neither to spare. The work was physical in a way that broke most people. 12-hour days minimum, 16 hours when weather cooperated, operating equipment in heat that still pushed 90 even in September. Dust everywhere, getting in eyes and lungs and the machinery, requiring constant cleaning and maintenance. Bate developed a cough that wouldn't quit, her lungs protesting the dust and diesel fumes and stress. On day 6 of harvest, the Massey Ferguson's clutch started slipping. Bate noticed it first, the pedal going soft, engagement point shifting, the kind of mechanical failure that started small and cascaded fast. She radioed Deck, who was running the combine. Clutches going on the Massey. Might have today and tomorrow before it fails completely. Can you nurse it? I can try. Bate adjusted her driving style, shifting gentle, avoiding high RPMs, babying the tractor through the remaining days. On day 9, the clutch failed completely, pedal going to the floor with no resistance, transmission disconnected from the engine. Bate coasted to a stop in the middle of the field and radioed the bad news. Clutch is done. I'm dead in the field. Carl Jensen's voice came over the radio. Bring your tools. We'll swap it out. They worked through the night. Bate and Carl and Tom Anderson, pulling the transmission in darkness using work lights powered by a generator that ran on diesel and sounded like an angry lawnmower. The clutch assembly was destroyed, friction disc worn to nothing, pressure plate springs broken. Carl had a spare in his shop, 15 years old but functional, drove back to his place and returned at midnight with parts. They installed it by 3 in the morning, Bates' hands cramping from holding tools in awkward positions, back screaming from lying under the tractor on ground that was hard as concrete. Carl supervised, calling out instructions, handing her tools, talking her through the process. Tom held the flashlight and made coffee on a camp stove and kept them going with terrible jokes that would have been funny if they weren't so tired. By 5 a.m. the tractor was running again. Bate tested the clutch, engagement smooth, no slipping. She wanted to sleep for 3 days, but there were still 5 days of harvest left and combines waiting. Harvest finished September 21st, 4 days before the first hard frost that would have damaged any remaining wheat. Final yield, 17,800 bushels. Deck sold it all to the grain elevator in Miles City, the one independent operation Western Prairie didn't control yet. Price was $3.85 per bushel as projected. Gross revenue, $68,530. Bate helped Deck with the accounting in his farmhouse office, adding up costs that had accumulated over the growing season. Operating loan $52,000. Equipment repairs $12,000 including the Massey clutch and combined maintenance. Fuel and fertilizer $8,000. Labor costs for seasonal workers during planting and harvest $9,000. Total expenses $81,000. Deck stared at the numbers. We lost $12,470 this year. Bate did the math in her head. If you hadn't paid me anything, we'd have cleared $19,000. And if you hadn't given me $27,000 in June, the bank would have foreclosed and I'd have cleared zero because I wouldn't own the farm anymore. Deck closed the ledger. We survived. That's what matters. But surviving cost Bate her savings and Marcus's life insurance and the Ford Ranger, and it cost Deck any cushion for next year. If 1994 brought another drought or another crisis, there was no reserve to draw on. They were operating on hope and determination and nothing else. November brought the lawsuit. Deck was served papers on a Tuesday morning, sheriff's deputy knocking on the farmhouse door at 7 a.m., with documents that spelled out Western Prairie Consolidated's legal attack in language dense enough to require a law degree to parse. Bate was there when Deck opened the envelope, standing in the kitchen drinking coffee before heading out to check cattle. She watched his face change from confused to angry as he read. "What is it?" Deck handed her the papers. "They're suing me for water rights violations, claiming my irrigation well is drawing from an aquifer that affects their properties, asking for $175,000 in damages plus an injunction to shut down my well." Bate scanned the legal language. Can they do that? They can file the lawsuit. Whether they win is another question. My well has been legal since 1952. Grandfather got the permit, all the paperwork is in order, but defending against this is going to cost money I don't have. How much? Lawyer quoted me $40,000 to $60,000 depending on how long it drags out. Discovery, depositions, expert witnesses, court costs. Even if I win, I'm bankrupt from legal fees. Carl Jensen heard about the lawsuit and called an emergency meeting at the VFW Hall in Glendive. 23 farmers showed up, 17 of them veterans from Korea or Vietnam or Desert Storm, all of them understanding that what was happening to Deck could happen to any of them if Western Prairie wasn't stopped. Carl stood at the front of the room, a map of Dawson County spread on a table showing property lines and water rights and well locations. He pointed to 4 farms that had been sued by Western Prairie in the past 18 months, all for various technical violations of environmental regulations or water rights or land use permits. All 4 had settled rather than fight, selling their land to Western Prairie at below market prices because legal costs would have bankrupted them. This is the pattern. Carl's voice was hard, controlled anger underneath. They can't force us to sell, so they use lawsuits to drain our resources until we have no choice. Deck's well has been legal for 40 years. This suit is harassment, but defending it costs money he doesn't have after the drought year. He looked around the room. So we're creating a legal defense fund. Montana Veterans Agriculture Defense. Every farmer contributes what they can. We pool resources and hire the best water rights attorney in the state to fight this. Not just for Deck, for all of us. Tom Anderson stood up. How much do we need? $50,000 to be safe. That covers attorney fees, expert witnesses, court costs, everything. I'll put in $5,000. Anderson's voice was firm. My cattle operation cleared $30,000 this year. I can spare $5,000. Richard Moss stood. $3,000 from me. Sheep prices were good. One by one farmers stood and pledged money. $2,000 here, $3,000 there, $500 from the ones who'd had bad years. Bate watched it happen and understood she was seeing something rare, a community deciding that collective survival mattered more than individual profit. When the pledges were tallied, they had $48,000. Close, but not enough. Bate stood up. I'll contribute $3,000. That gets us to 51. The room went quiet. Everyone knew Bates' financial situation, knew she'd already given $27,000 to keep Deck farming through the drought. Carl started to object, but Bate cut him off. This isn't about Deck anymore. This is about whether corporations can use lawsuits as weapons to steal land from family farmers. If we let them win here, they'll do it to everyone in this room. So we fight, all of us, together. The Montana Veterans Agriculture Defense Fund was established November 15, 1993. Carl Jensen served as treasurer. They hired Thomas Blackwood, a water rights attorney from Billings with 30 years' experience and a reputation for winning cases that looked unwinnable. Blackwood reviewed the lawsuit and the well permits and the aquifer data, met with Deck and Bate and Carl in December to outline their defense strategy. Western Prairie's case is garbage. Blackwood was 60, gray beard, eyes sharp as broken glass. Your well is grandfathered under 1952 water rights law. The aquifer data shows your usage is 0.03% of total draw. You couldn't affect their properties if you pumped 24/7 for a decade. This is pure harassment. Can we win? We can win, but it's going to take 8 months minimum. Discovery, depositions, expert testimony, court dates. They'll drag it out as long as possible to maximize your costs. That's the strategy. Make it too expensive to fight so you settle. We're not settling. Good, then we fight. December brought Deck's health crisis. He'd been ignoring symptoms for months. The fatigue and the blurred vision and the constant thirst that meant his blood sugar was out of control. His A1C had climbed to 11.2, kidney function down to 28%. The diabetes winning the slow war it had been fighting since Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam gave him the disease 30 years ago. Bate found him collapsed in the barn on a Tuesday morning, December 14th. She'd arrived at 5:30 for cattle check and found Deck on the concrete floor unconscious, skin cold and clammy, pulse weak and rapid. Combat medic training kicked in automatic. Check airway, check breathing, check circulation. His blood sugar meter was in his pocket. She tested him. 39. Severe hypoglycemia, probably from insulin dose miscalculation combined with not eating. She ran to the farmhouse, grabbed the glucagon emergency kit from his refrigerator, injected it intramuscular in his thigh. Called 911. Stayed with him, monitoring pulse and breathing, talking to him even though he couldn't hear, telling him to hold on, telling him help was coming. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later. Paramedics got IV access, pushed glucose, Deck's blood sugar came up to 90, and he regained consciousness in the ambulance on the way to Glendive Hospital. Bate rode with him, holding his hand, watching monitors that showed heart rate and oxygen saturation and blood pressure, all the numbers that meant life or death. At the hospital, the doctor was direct. Mr. Decker, your diabetes is out of control. A1C is 11.2, which puts you at extreme risk for complications. Your kidneys are failing. You're looking at dialysis within 2 years if you don't make major lifestyle changes. Deck's voice was weak but stubborn. Define major lifestyle changes. No stress, strict diet, regular exercise, blood sugar monitoring 4 times daily, and no more farming. That last one isn't going to happen. The doctor was maybe 40, young enough to still believe medicine could fix everything. Mr. Decker, farming is killing you. The physical stress, the mental stress, the irregular eating, the long hours. Your body can't handle it anymore. My body's been handling it for 60 years. It'll handle a few more. You collapsed this morning. If Ms. Morgan hadn't found you when she did, you'd be dead. Is that how you want this to end? Deck looked at the ceiling tiles, quiet for a long moment, finally spoke. How I want it to end is with my farm still in my family and Western Prairie destroyed. Everything else is details. The doctor left shaking his head. Bates stayed. Hospital policy allowed one visitor overnight and she wasn't leaving. You need to slow down. Her voice was gentle but firm. Let me handle more of the operations. You supervise, but I do the physical work. Deck turned his head to look at her. You're already doing most of it. Then make it official. Promote me to acting manager, full authority to make day-to-day decisions. You handle strategy and finances. I handle everything else. That's not fair to you. This should be my burden. It stopped being just your burden when I gave you $27,000 to save the farm. We're partners now whether you like it or not. Dex smiled for the first time since collapsing. Linda would have liked you. She didn't take no for an answer either. Then honor her memory by not dying in a barn, because you're too stubborn to delegate. Deck extended his hand. Acting farm manager. $12 an hour plus 15% net profit when there is profit. Bates shook his hand. Deal. January 1994 brought the coldest winter in 20 years, temperatures dropping to 30 below zero and staying there for 2 weeks. Bate ran the farm with Deck supervising from the warmth of the farmhouse, making decisions over the phone or during brief visits to check progress. She managed winter cattle feeding, checking the herd daily for illness or injury, breaking ice on water tanks that froze solid overnight despite heaters, throwing hay bales to animals that huddled together for warmth. The work was brutal, operating equipment in cold that made metal brittle and hydraulic fluid thick as molasses, starting diesel engines that didn't want to run when cylinder walls were frozen, working with hands that went numb inside insulated gloves within minutes of exposure. But Bate had been a combat medic in the Saudi desert working in heat that hit 130 degrees. She'd learned that the human body could adapt to almost anything if the mind stayed strong. Cold was just another challenge, same as heat or fear or exhaustion. You adapted or you failed. She chose adaptation. The legal battle with Western Prairie dragged through winter. Discovery requests, depositions, expert witness preparation. Blackwood kept Deck and Bate updated monthly on progress, but made clear this would be a marathon, not a sprint. Western Prairie had unlimited legal resources, and they were using all of them to make the case as expensive and time-consuming as possible. The stress showed on Deck. He was losing weight, down to 165 pounds from 190 before the drought year. His face was drawn, eyes hollow, skin gray. The diabetes medications made him nauseous, and the stress made his blood sugar spike despite the medications. He was dying slowly, and everyone could see it except him. Bate watched it happen and felt helpless. She could manage the farm, but she couldn't make Deck take care of himself. Couldn't force him to eat when he had no appetite. Couldn't make him sleep when worry kept him awake at 3 a.m. doing financial calculations that never added up right. Carl Jensen visited in February, sat with Deck in the farmhouse kitchen drinking coffee, and talking about nothing important for an hour before getting to the point. You're killing yourself over this farm. Deck set his coffee cup down. This farm is all I have left. Linda's gone. Kyle's working for the enemy. My health is failing. If I lose the farm, I've got nothing. You've got Bate. You've got this community. You've got veterans who would go to war for you. That's not nothing. It's not a legacy. Carl leaned forward. Legacy isn't land or equipment or a name on a deed. Legacy is what you pass on to people who come after you. You taught Bate farming. She's teaching others. That's legacy. You stood up to Western Prairie when everyone else sold out. That gave the rest of us courage to stand up too. That's legacy. He paused. You're so focused on saving the farm that you're missing the fact you already saved something bigger. You saved the idea that family farms matter, that community matters, that some things are worth fighting for even when you know you might lose. Deck's eyes went wet. I'm 60 years old and I'm tired. I know, Carl's voice was gentle, but you're not alone. Let Bate run the farm. Let us fight the legal battle. Let the community carry some of this weight. You've carried it alone long enough. That night Deck made his decision. Called Bate to the farmhouse office, showed her the ledgers and the financial projections and the legal documents and everything else she'd need to run the operation without his constant oversight. As of today, you're farm manager, not acting, full authority. You make the calls on planting, harvesting, equipment, hiring, everything. I'm here as advisor, but you're in charge. Bate looked at the ledgers, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like physical mass. What about the lawsuit? Blackwood and the defense fund handle that. Your job is to keep this farm operating. My job is to stay alive long enough to see how this ends. You're going to see how this ends. Bates' voice was firm. We're going to win the lawsuit, survive the winter, plant in spring, and harvest in fall. And you're going to be here for all of it. Deck smiled. You sound pretty sure about that. I'm a combat medic. We don't give up on patients just because the odds are bad. And I'm not giving up on you. February ended with the farm running smoothly under Bates' management. The cattle were healthy, the equipment was maintained, the finances were stable if not comfortable. Deck's health was still declining but slower now that stress was reduced. The lawsuit was progressing toward a summer trial date. Western Prairie's harassment continued, but the community resistance was holding. Bate drove home to Glendive on the last night of February, exhausted but satisfied. Jackson was 15 now, tall and strong, doing well in school despite his mother working 60-hour weeks. Emma was 12, bright and curious, reading above grade level and talking about being a veterinarian when she grew up. They asked her over dinner how work was going. Bate told them about fixing the cattle fence and maintaining the combine and planning spring planting. Told them about the community coming together to fight Western Prairie. Told them about Deck getting healthier because he wasn't carrying the whole burden alone anymore. She didn't tell them that the fight was far from over. That Western Prairie was still circling like a predator waiting for weakness. That one bad year could still destroy everything they'd built. That the lawsuit could drain the defense fund and leave them vulnerable. They were kids. They didn't need to know that their mother was fighting a war against an enemy with unlimited resources and that the outcome was still uncertain. What they needed to know was that she was still fighting, still hadn't quit, still believed that determination mattered more than resources. Because if Beth Morgan had learned anything in 41 years of life and 2 years of farming, it was this. The fight wasn't over until you stopped fighting, and she hadn't stopped. Not when she'd had $67 and 6 rejections. Not when she'd sacrificed her savings and her truck and her husband's life insurance. Not when drought destroyed half the crop and left them operating on hope. Not when Western Prairie filed a harassment lawsuit designed to bankrupt them. Not ever. Deck had asked her what she was willing to fight for. She'd said her kids. But the answer was bigger now. She was fighting for the idea that ordinary people could stand up to corporations, that family farms mattered, that community mattered, that veterans took care of each other. That legacy was built not through land or money, but through the people you helped and the principles you refused to compromise. Western Prairie thought they could win through money and lawyers and systematic harassment. They were wrong. Because they were fighting numbers. Bate and Deck and Carl and the veteran network were fighting for something numbers couldn't measure. They were fighting for survival, for dignity, for the right to own your land and make your own choices and live your life on your own terms. And that was a fight worth having, even if the odds were impossible. Especially if the odds were impossible. March 1994 came to Dawson County with weather that looked like redemption. Snow fell heavy through the first 2 weeks, accumulating 18 inches across the wheat fields, moisture that would soak into the ground when it melted and give spring planting the water reserves the previous year had lacked. The long-range forecast showed above-average precipitation through June, and every farmer who'd survived the drought year allowed themselves to hope that 1994 might be the recovery year they desperately needed. Bates stood in the machine shed on a Tuesday morning checking equipment that would soon be needed for spring planting. The John Deere 7700 grain drill sat ready, every bearing greased, every seed tube cleaned, the whole machine maintained to specifications that Deck had drilled into her over 2 years of training. The Massey Ferguson tractor with its replacement clutch ran smooth, no slipping, reliable as morning coffee. The sprayer and the fertilizer spreader, and all the other implements required for modern farming were prepared and waiting. She was running through a mental checklist when Deck walked in, moving slower than he had 6 months ago, his weight down to 158 now, skin that gray color that spoke of organs failing despite medication. He'd been to the VA hospital in Billings the previous week for tests, routine monitoring they'd told him, but Bate had been a medic long enough to know when doctors were worried about something they weren't saying out loud. "We need to talk." Deck's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded bad news. Bate set down the grease gun she'd been using. They walked to the farmhouse kitchen, the same table where they'd made every major decision for the past 2 years, and Deck pulled out a folder of medical records that looked too thick for routine monitoring. "The cancer's back." He said it flat, no emotion, just fact delivered the way a soldier delivers a casualty report. "Pancreatic, stage 4. They found it 3 years ago, did surgery and chemo, thought they got it all, but it metastasized to the liver. Scans show it spread too far for more surgery." Bates' hands went cold. "How long?" 6 to 9 months without treatment. Maybe a year with chemo, but the oncologist says chemo at this stage just buys time with terrible quality of life. "I'm choosing no treatment." "Deck, I'm 61 years old. I've got diabetes that's destroying my kidneys, cancer that's destroying my liver, and a body that's been worked hard for 6 decades. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying before I know this farm is going to survive." He pulled more papers from the folder, legal documents this time. "I've been thinking about succession. Kyle doesn't want the farm. He made that clear when he took the job with Western Prairie. My daughter Sarah lives in Portland, married to a dentist, no interest in farming. That leaves you." Deck slid a document across the table. "Partnership agreement. I'm offering you 50% ownership of this operation. Purchase price is $600,000, half the appraised value. You put down $40,000, pay me $4,500 per month for 15 years at 4% interest. Total cost $750,000 for half of an operation worth $1.2 million. Bates stared at the numbers. "Deck, I don't have $40,000. I gave you $27,000 last year. My savings is back to maybe $6,000. Then mortgage your house. Take a loan against future earnings. Find the money however you can, because this is your future and your kids' future. When I die, which is going to be soon, my half goes to Sarah unless you buy it from her. And she'll sell to Western Prairie the day after my funeral because she needs money for her kids' college, and she's got no emotional attachment to land she's never worked. What if I can't make the payments?" Then the farm goes to foreclosure and Western Prairie wins, and everything we've fought for dies with me. Deck's voice was hard now, Marine Corps orders that expected compliance. But I don't think you'll fail. I think you're the toughest person I've ever met, and I think you'll find a way to make this work because that's what you do. You find ways. Bate looked at the partnership agreement, the numbers swimming in front of her eyes. 40,000 down, 4,500 per month, 750,000 total. It was impossible. It was insane. It was the only chance she had to own something that mattered. I need time to think. You've got 48 hours. After that, the offer expires and I start looking for other buyers. Bate drove back to Glendive that night with the partnership agreement on the passenger seat and a calculator in her head running numbers that wouldn't add up right. Her house was worth maybe $60,000. She'd bought it in 1992 for $44,000 cash from her savings before the drought year. She could mortgage it for $40,000 if the bank approved. That covered the down payment but left her with two mortgages, the farm payment plus the house payment, $5,300 total every month. Her salary as farm manager was $12 per hour plus 15% of net profit. At 50 hours per week, that was $31,200 annually from wages. The profit share was zero in drought years, but could be $15,000 to $20,000 in good years. Total income between $31,000 and $51,000 depending on the year. After the two mortgages, she'd have maybe $2,000 per month for everything else. Jackson was 15, college in 3 years. Emma was 12, college in 6 years. Bate had exactly $0 saved for their education after spending everything on saving the farm. The smart decision was to say no, walk away, keep working for wages, let someone else take the risk. But Bate had been a combat medic. She'd made decisions under fire that determined who lived and who died. She understood that smart decisions and right decisions weren't always the same thing. The smart decision in a field hospital was sometimes to let the critical patient die so you could save 3 stable ones. The right decision was to fight for every patient regardless of odds. This was the same calculation. Smart was safe wages with no risk. Right was ownership and legacy, and the chance to build something that would outlive her. She called the bank the next morning, explained what she needed. The loan officer was skeptical. Mortgaging a house to buy partnership in a farm that lost money last year wasn't the kind of investment banks liked. But Bate had 2 years of steady employment, good credit, and determination that came through the phone line like physical force. The bank approved $40,000 against the house at 6.5% over 15 years, $390 per month. Combined with the farm payment, Bates' total obligations would be $4,890 monthly. Possible if the farm made money. Catastrophic if it didn't. She signed the partnership agreement on March 17, 1994. Deck witnessed it. They filed it with the county recorder, and Bate became 50% owner of an 840-acre wheat and cattle operation worth approximately $1.2 million. She was 40 years old, had $6,000 in savings, owned half a farm, and was leveraged to the point where one bad year would destroy her financially. It felt like the best decision she'd ever made. Spring planting happened in April under weather conditions that cooperated for the first time in 2 years. Soil moisture was excellent from the winter snow. Temperature warmed gradually, allowing early planting without frost risk. Bate managed the operation with Deck supervising from the farmhouse, making the calls on which fields to plant when, coordinating seasonal labor, running equipment 16 hours a day when conditions were perfect. They planted all 840 acres, half to hard red spring wheat and half to durum wheat that commanded premium prices from pasta manufacturers. The seed was certified, purchased through the veteran network pooling system that Carl Jensen had formalized into an actual cooperative. Equipment ran smoothly. Weather held. By May 15th, planting was complete and emergence was 92%, the best germination rates DEC had seen in a decade. But the legal battle was draining resources faster than the farm could generate them. The lawsuit had gone to discovery phase, which meant depositions and expert witnesses and legal fees that accumulated like compound interest. The Veterans Defense Fund was covering costs, but the fund was down to $18,000 from the original $51,000. Thomas Blackwood estimated another 6 months before trial, which meant another $20,000 to $30,000 in legal expenses. Carl Jensen called a meeting of the fund contributors in May. 15 farmers gathered at the VFW Hall, the same veterans who'd pledged money 8 months earlier, now facing the reality that this fight was going to cost more than originally estimated. "We need another 30,000 to see this through to trial." Carl laid it out straight. "Blackwood says Western Prairie is using delay tactics to drain us. They file motions, demand continuances, request additional depositions. Every delay costs money. They've got unlimited legal budget. We don't." Tom Anderson spoke up from the back. "We've already contributed 51,000. How much more are they going to bleed us?" "As much as it takes to make us quit." Carl's voice was hard. "That's the strategy. Make it so expensive that we can't afford to fight even though we're right. DEC's well is legal. The aquifer data proves he's not affecting their properties. But none of that matters if we can't afford to present the evidence in court." Richard Moss stood. "I'm out." His voice was apologetic but firm. "Sheep prices crashed this spring. I lost 40,000 on my breeding stock. I don't have money to contribute." 3 other farmers echoed the sentiment. Bad years, unexpected expenses, margins too thin to spare cash for legal battles. By the time everyone spoke, the room was quiet. Only 8 of the original 15 were willing or able to contribute more money. Carl did the math. If the 8 of us split 30,000, that's $3,750 each. That's a lot of money for most operations. Bates stood. "I'll put in 7,500. That leaves 22,500 for the rest of you." The room went quiet. Everyone knew Bate had just taken on massive debt to buy partnership in the farm. 7,500 was probably every dollar she had saved. Carl tried to object. "You can't afford that." "Neither can DEC. And if we lose this lawsuit, Western Prairie shuts down his well and the farm fails, and I lose my investment and my job and everything. So I'm not contributing out of charity. I'm protecting my own interest." She looked around the room. "We're all in this together. If DEC falls, Western Prairie comes after the rest of us next. They're using him to test their legal strategy. If it works, they'll replicate it on every holdout farm in eastern Montana. So we fight now or we surrender later. I choose fight." The remaining 7 farmers pledged the balance, 30,000 total. The Veterans Defense Fund was replenished. The legal battle continued. June brought the news about Kyle. Bate was checking cattle in the north pasture when DEC called on the 2-way radio, voice tight with emotion she couldn't identify. "Bate, come to the house. Kyle's here." She found them in the kitchen, DEC sitting at the table looking older than his 61 years. Kyle standing by the window looking uncomfortable in khakis and a button-down shirt that screamed corporate drone. He'd put on weight, face fuller than Bate remembered from his last visit 2 years ago, soft around the middle the way men get when they work desk jobs and stop doing physical labor. "Kyle," Bate kept her voice neutral. "Bate," he nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "I hear you're DEC's partner now, 50% owner." "That's right." He turned to his father. "Dad, I came to apologize. I was wrong about Western Prairie. I thought they were the future of agriculture. Turns out they're just a corporation trying to maximize shareholder value by any means necessary. Deck's face showed nothing. What changed your mind? I saw the strategy documents. Kyle's voice was bitter. PowerPoint presentations about acquiring distressed properties through legal harassment and financial pressure. Target lists of holdout farmers with detailed plans for forcing sales. Your name was at the top of the list. They assigned me to develop operational plans for integrating your acreage into their consolidated operation. He paused. They wanted me to plan the takeover of my father's farm. I quit the next day. Deck still showed no emotion. What are you doing now? Looking for work. Engineering firms, agricultural consultancies. Nothing yet. Turns out being unemployed at 34 with a 2-year gap in your resume isn't great for job prospects. Bate watched this play out and understood that Kyle was here looking for something. Forgiveness, or maybe a job, or maybe just acknowledgement that he'd made a mistake and was trying to correct it. Deck stood up, walked to the sink, looked out the window at fields his great-grandfather had broken in 1887. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Bate had ever heard it. You broke my heart when you went to work for them, not because you chose a different career, because you chose the people trying to destroy what 4 generations built. Your great-great-grandfather died breaking this land. Your grandfather died farming it. I'm dying farming it. And you helped the enemy. I know, Kyle's voice cracked. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix it. Deck turned around, but working to fix it might. You've got an engineering degree and agricultural operations experience. We need someone who can optimize equipment usage, analyze yield data, develop market strategies. I can't pay you what Western Prairie paid, $36,000 per year to start, but it's honest work fighting for the right side. Kyle stared at his father. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance to prove you meant the apology. 1 year. You work the farm, show me you're committed, we'll talk about long-term partnership. But you screw up again, or you quit, or you decide farming isn't for you, you're out and you don't get another chance. Bate watched Kyle's face cycle through emotions, surprise and relief, and something that might have been shame. He nodded. 1 year, I'll prove it. Then you start Monday, 5:30 a.m., wear work clothes. July and August brought perfect growing weather. Adequate rainfall, moderate temperatures, the wheat growing strong and healthy in fields that showed no signs of the stress that had killed last year's crop. Bate walked the rows in early August doing visual inspection, checking for disease or pest damage, finding nothing but healthy plants with heads forming fat and full. Deck walked those same fields with her, moving slower now, his cancer progressing despite his refusal to acknowledge it. He'd lost another 15 pounds, down to 143, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that looked skeletal. But his mind was sharp, and his eye for crop conditions was still better than anyone Bate had ever met. Best crop I've seen in 20 years. Deck's voice held satisfaction. Yield's going to be 35,000 bushels minimum, maybe 40 if conditions hold through September. What's the price projection? Hard red spring is trading at $4.20 per bushel. Durham's at $5.10. We're looking at 140 to 160,000 gross revenue depending on final yields. Bate did the math. After the operating loan and expenses, we'll net maybe 60 to 70,000. That covers my farm payment, your cancer treatment if you change your mind about that, next year's operating costs with some left over. Deck stopped walking, looked at her with eyes that held knowledge of his own ending. I'm not changing my mind about treatment. Cancer's going to win regardless. Chemo just makes the last few months miserable. I'd rather die working than die puking. You're not dying yet. I'm dying slower than expected. That's different from not dying. September brought harvest and Kyle proved himself. He coordinated equipment logistics, managed grain hauling schedules, ran the combine with competence that surprised Bate. 2 years in an office hadn't erased the farming knowledge his father had drilled into him growing up. He worked 16-hour days without complaint, showed up on time, took direction from Bate without ego. Deck watched his son from the farmhouse porch, too weak now to do physical work but still supervising. Bate saw something in Deck's face she hadn't seen before. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of it. The understanding that people made mistakes and sometimes they learned from them and grew into better versions of themselves. Harvest finished September 23rd with final yields exceeding projections. 38,000 bushels total, split between hard red spring and durum. Deck held the grain, gambling on price increases through the fall as export demand drove commodity markets higher. By October 15th, hard red spring had climbed to $4.60 per bushel and durum to $5.40. Deck sold half the crop, locked in profits, held the remainder betting on further increases. The gamble paid off. By November 1st, prices were at $4.90 and $5.70. He sold the rest. Final revenue, $168,000. After operating costs and loan payments and equipment maintenance and labor, the farm netted $73,000. Bates' 15% profit share was $10,950. Combined with her wages, she'd made $42,000 for the year. She paid her mortgages, bought Jackson new clothes for his junior year of high school, put $3,000 toward Emma's future college fund, and still had $6,000 left in savings. For the first time since Marcus died, she felt something like financial security. Deck paid off the operating loan completely, cleared $50,000 in personal income, and set aside $20,000 for next year's operating costs. The farm was healthy again, debt-free except for Bates' partnership payments, operating with a cushion instead of on fumes. The lawsuit went to trial in December 1994. Thomas Blackwood presented Western Prairie's harassment strategy in clinical detail. Showed the court aquifer data proving Deck's well usage was 0.03% of total draw. Called expert witnesses who testified the well couldn't affect Western Prairie's properties if it ran 24/7 for 50 years. Presented the 1952 water rights permits that grandfathered Deck's usage under state law. Western Prairie's attorneys argued that consolidation of agricultural operations required optimization of water resources. That Deck's well, while technically legal, represented inefficient usage that should be modernized. That the interests of a large-scale operation serving hundreds of consumers should outweigh the interests of one small family farm. The judge was a woman named Patricia Morrison, 64 years old, ranch background herself, daughter of homesteaders who'd broken land in Custer County in the 1920s. She listened to 3 days of testimony and expert witnesses and legal arguments. Then she rendered her verdict. Western Prairie's case is without merit. Her voice carried authority that shut down any thought of appeal. Mr. Decker's water rights are grandfathered under state law. The aquifer data shows his usage is negligible. This lawsuit is transparent harassment designed to force the sale of property through financial pressure. Case dismissed with prejudice. Western Prairie is ordered to pay Mr. Decker's legal costs totaling $68,000. The courtroom erupted. Carl Jensen pumped his fist. Tom Anderson let out a whoop that got him a glare from the bailiff. Bate felt tears forming and didn't care who saw. Deck sat quiet in the gallery, face showing nothing, but Bate saw his hands shaking. 61 years of farming, 3 years fighting cancer, 2 years fighting a legal battle designed to break him financially. And he'd won. Outside the courthouse, Kenneth Ashford stood with his attorneys looking like a man who'd bet everything on a hand and lost. He saw Deck walking out, and for a moment their eyes met. Ashford's face showed something between respect and hatred. "This isn't over." Deck's voice was tired but firm. "Yes, it is. You lost. Go back to Chicago and tell your investors that family farms in Montana don't surrender just because corporations want their land." The $68,000 in legal cost reimbursement arrived in January 1995. Deck split it according to Veterans Defense Fund contributions. Bate got her $7,500 back. Carl and the other contributors got their shares. The fund was dissolved with $3,000 remaining that got donated to the Montana Veterans Agriculture Alliance, a nonprofit Carl established to help other farmers facing similar corporate pressure. Winter brought Deck's final decline. The cancer had spread to his lungs and bones. He was on morphine for pain management, sleeping 18 hours a day, unable to eat more than a few bites before nausea forced him to stop. His weight dropped to 128. He looked like a refugee from a concentration camp, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Bate visited every evening after farm work, sitting by his bedside in the farmhouse where he'd lived for 40 years, talking about crop plans for spring and equipment maintenance and cattle breeding programs, talking about anything except the fact that he was dying and they both knew it. In early February, he called her to the house during the day, unusual because he was usually asleep during daylight hours. She found him in the office, paperwork spread across the desk, looking more alert than he had in weeks. "I need to finalize my will." His voice was weak but determined. "Sarah gets the house and $200,000 cash. Kyle gets my half of the farm equipment, valued at about $150,000. You get first right of refusal on my 50% farm ownership if Sarah wants to sell." Bates sat down, the weight of this settling on her. "What if I can't afford to buy it?" "Then Sarah sells to someone else and you have a new partner, but I'm betting you'll find a way. You always do." He pulled out another document. "Partnership buyout agreement. If Sarah sells within 2 years of my death, purchase price is $550,000, 10% below market value. You'd owe her that amount however you can finance it. If she holds longer than 2 years, price goes to market value." Bates' voice was tight. "That's another mortgage on top of the one I already have. You'll own the whole farm. 840 acres, all equipment, all cattle, complete operation. You'll owe money, but you'll own something real, something you can pass to your kids." He paused, breathing labored. "Linda made me promise not to let corporations take this land. I kept that promise. Now I'm asking you to keep it. Own this farm. Work it. Make it profitable. Pass it to Jackson or Emma if they want it. Keep it in hands that care about land and community instead of quarterly profits." "I promise." Deck smiled for the first time in weeks. "Good. Now get out of here. I'm tired." He died on March 7, 1995, peacefully at home with Bate and Kyle and Sarah present. The funeral filled Glendive Methodist Church beyond capacity. 300 people, every farmer in Dawson County, veterans from 4 wars, suppliers and customers, and people whose lives Deck had touched through 6 decades of living right and fighting for what mattered. Bates spoke at the service, standing at the pulpit looking at hundreds of faces, throat tight with grief. "Deck gave me a chance when I had $67 and no options. He taught me farming, trusted me with his land, made me his partner. He fought Western Prairie when everyone else sold out. He proved that one person with determination can stand against corporations with unlimited resources." She paused, finding words that felt inadequate. "Deck used to say that legacy isn't land or money. It's what you pass on to people who come after you. He passed on the belief that family farms matter, that community matters, that some things are worth fighting for even when you know you might lose." Her voice broke, but she kept going. "I'll keep this farm operating. I'll teach others the way Deck taught me. I'll fight for the same things he fought for. That's his legacy. That's what survives." Sarah approached Bate 3 weeks after the funeral. They met at a coffee shop in Billings, neutral territory, two women connected by a dead man they'd both loved in different ways. "I'm selling my half of the farm." Sarah's voice was direct, no pretense. "The house sold for $190,000. I'm using that for my kids' college fund. But I need the money from the farm too. $550,000. Can you pay it?" Bate had spent 3 weeks running numbers, talking to banks, exploring every financing option that existed. The answer was maybe if everything went perfectly, and nothing went wrong, and the next 5 years brought decent harvests and good prices. "I can get a loan for $400,000 secured against the land. I have $30,000 in savings after this year's profit. I need to borrow $120,000 more from somewhere." Sarah sipped her coffee. "What if I do owner financing on the 120? You pay me $2,000 per month for 5 years at 6% interest. That's $144,000 total over 5 years. Can you handle that plus the bank loan?" Bate did the math. Bank loan at $400,000 would cost about $3,200 monthly. Sarah's owner financing added $2,000. Total $5,200 per month in farm debt plus her house mortgage of $390. $5,590 total monthly obligations. The farm had netted $73,000 last year. If that continued, she'd clear enough to cover the mortgages with money left over. But one bad year would destroy her. One drought like 1993 and she'd lose everything. "Yes, I can handle it." Sarah looked at her across the table, something shifting in her expression. "You loved him, didn't you? Not romantically, but you loved my father." Bate felt tears forming. "He saved my life. When I had nothing and no one would hire me, he asked one question and gave me a chance. Everything I have, everything my kids have, came from that moment." Sarah's voice softened. "He talked about you in those last weeks. Said you reminded him of Mom. Said you were the daughter he wished I'd been." Bate wiped her eyes. "You were the daughter he had. He loved you." "I know, but I wasn't interested in farming. You were. That mattered to him." Sarah reached across the table, squeezed Bate's hand. "Take care of his land. He trusted you with it. That's enough for me." They signed the papers in April 1995. Bate became 100% owner of Decker Farm. 840 acres of land appraised at $950,000. Equipment worth $200,000. Cattle operation worth $50,000. Total value $1.2 million. Her total debt was $520,000 to the bank, plus $120,000 to Sarah, plus $40,000 remaining on her house. $680,000 in total obligations, against $1.2 million in assets. She had $520,000 in equity and monthly payments that would consume most of her farm income for the next 15 years. She was 40 years old, owned a farm completely, and was leveraged so heavily that financial disaster was always one bad year away. It felt like victory. Kyle stayed on as operations manager. They formalized the arrangement in May, giving him 20% ownership in exchange for sweat equity and commitment to work the farm for 5 years minimum. Bate retained 60%, gave the remaining 20% to 5 long-term employees who'd been with the operation for 3+ years. The ownership structure meant everyone had skin in the game. Everyone benefited from success and suffered from failure. It created loyalty deeper than wages could buy. June brought Bate's first major decision as sole owner. The farm needed a new combine. The old John Deere 8450 was 30 years old and breaking down constantly. A new combine cost $250,000. Used models ran 120 to 160. Bate had maybe 40,000 available for equipment purchases after covering all her other obligations. She called a meeting of the ownership group. 7 people sitting around the kitchen table in the farmhouse that now belonged to Bate. Kyle, 3 seasonal workers who'd been elevated to part owners, 1 bookkeeper, 2 equipment operators. We need a combine. New is out of reach. Used is possible if we all contribute. I'm proposing we each put in based on ownership percentage. I pay 60%, Kyle pays 20, you 5 split the remaining 20. Total cost $140,000 for a used case IH that's got low hours and solid maintenance records. The group voted unanimously yes. Everyone contributed their share. They bought the combine in July. Harvest would happen with equipment they owned outright, no lease payments, no corporate financing with strings attached. September 1995 brought weather that cooperated and yields that exceeded projections. 42,000 bushels, prices stable at $450 for hard red spring and $520 for durum. Revenue $178,000. Net profit after all expenses $79,000. Bates' 60% of profit was $47,400. Combined with her management salary of $36,000, she'd made $83,000 for the year. After mortgage payments, she cleared $28,000 for living expenses and savings. Jackson graduated high school in 1996. Got accepted to Montana State for agricultural economics. Bate paid his tuition from farm profits, $13,000 per year, possible because the farm was profitable and she owned it and could make those decisions. Emma was 14, talking about veterinary school, grades excellent. Bate was building a college fund for her too, putting away money each year, planning ahead. Kyle married in 1997, a woman named Jennifer who worked as a teacher in Glendive. They bought a house 3 miles from the farm, had a daughter in 1998, named her Linda after Deck's wife, and Bate cried at the christening because legacy was continuing, family was growing, the farm was supporting another generation. The years between 1995 and 2008 were the building years. Bate paid down debt, upgraded equipment, increased acreage through leasing arrangements with neighboring farms. The operation grew from 840 acres to 1,500 by 2003. Revenue increased, profits accumulated, debt declined. By 2007, Bate had paid off the bank loan completely, owned the farm free and clear. Still owed Sarah $30,000 on the owner financing, final payment due in 2010. Her house mortgage would be paid off in 2012. Financial security that had seemed impossible in 1991, when she'd had $67, was now reality. She'd built something, through determination and sacrifice and refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. Through believing Deck when he said she could do this even though she had no experience. Through accepting help from veterans who understood that community mattered more than competition. The farm employed 12 people full-time, supported 6 families directly, contributed to the local economy through equipment purchases and supplies and grain sales. Bate had built not just wealth but legacy. And when people asked how she'd done it, how a combat medic with no farming background had gone from $67 to owning 1,500 acres, she gave the same answer every time. Deck asked me what I was willing to fight for. I gave an honest answer, and then I kept fighting even when it seemed impossible. That was the secret. Not talent or luck or special advantages, just determination to keep going when everyone else would have quit. Everything else was details. September 2008 arrived in Dawson County with weather that looked perfect for harvest, but carried news from New York that threatened to destroy everything Bate had built over 17 years. Lehman Brothers collapsed on the 15th, taking with it the assumption that financial systems were stable and markets were rational. By the end of the month, the entire global economy was in freefall, stock markets crashing, banks failing, credit markets frozen solid. Bate watched wheat prices collapse from $8.50 per bushel in July to $4.80 in October, a 44% crash in 90 days. The farm had 1,500 acres planted, projecting 60,000 bushels at harvest. At $8.50 per bushel, that would have been $510,000 in revenue. At $4.80, it was $288,000, a difference of $222,000 that evaporated like morning dew. She sat in the farmhouse office that had been Deck's and was now hers, looking at spreadsheets that told a story of financial catastrophe arriving just when everything seemed secure. The operating loan was $75,000, money borrowed in spring to cover seed and fertilizer and fuel, and all the other costs that came before harvest. Equipment payments were $18,000 remaining on the combine. Labor costs for the seasonal crew would be $32,000. Insurance, property taxes, utilities, maintenance, all the fixed costs that didn't care about commodity price crashes, totaled another $48,000. Total obligations $173,000. Revenue at current prices $288,000. That left $115,000 before paying herself or Kyle or the other part owners anything. Survivable but barely. And if prices dropped further, or if next year brought another crash, the cushion would disappear completely. Kyle walked into the office carrying coffee and the morning commodity reports that showed prices continuing to slide. He was 48 now, 15 years removed from his mistake with Western Prairie, hardened into the kind of farmer who could read futures markets and weather patterns with equal skill. His 20% ownership stake meant he felt every dollar of loss the same way Bate felt her 60%. We're looking at the same scenario as 93. His voice was matter-of-fact, no panic but clear recognition of the danger. One bad year we can survive. 2 bad years back-to-back and we're in serious trouble. Except we don't have the same cushion we had in 93. Bate set down her pen. No savings to draw on, no life insurance to liquidate, no house to mortgage because I already did that. If 2009 brings another crash, we're operating on nothing but hope. The cooperative is strong. Kyle pulled up a chair. 23 farms now, 18,400 acres combined. We've got direct marketing contracts with 5 artisan bakeries, organic certification on 800 of our acres, storage capacity to hold grain until prices recover. We're not in this alone anymore. Bate looked at the commodity reports, numbers that seemed designed to punish anyone who'd had the audacity to think farming could be profitable. But Kyle was right. The Montana Veterans Agriculture Cooperative that Carl Jensen had started in 1994 had grown into something substantial. 23 family farms working together, pooling resources, sharing equipment, negotiating contracts as a block. The kind of organization that could weather storms individual farms couldn't survive. All right, we hold the grain. Don't sell at $4.80. Wait for the panic to settle and prices to recover. If we can make it to spring without selling, we might see $6 again. That's a gamble. Everything's a gamble, but I'd rather gamble on markets recovering than accept prices that don't cover our costs. October brought harvest and the cooperative mobilized the way it had for 15 years. Combines and grain carts and trucks moving between member farms in coordinated efficiency that made the work faster and cheaper than any individual operation could manage. Bate ran logistics from the farmhouse, coordinating schedules by radio, directing equipment to wherever it was needed most. The harvest finished by October 23rd, 62,000 bushels total, yields slightly above projection because weather had cooperated even if markets hadn't. The grain went into storage bins at the cooperative facility, climate-controlled metal buildings that held 180,000 bushels from all member farms. The plan was to hold through winter, bet on prices recovering as panic subsided and the global economy stabilized. November brought the news that 9 farms in surrounding counties had failed, unable to survive the price crash on top of operating loans they couldn't service. Banks foreclosed. Equipment sold at auction. Land sold to the highest bidder, which in 3 cases was Western Prairie Consolidated, still circling like a predator that had learned patience. But all 23 farms in the cooperative survived. Not comfortably, not with profit, but they survived because they weren't fighting alone, because shared equipment meant lower costs, because direct marketing contracts meant some grain sold at premium prices that buffered against commodity market crashes, because storage capacity meant they could hold grain instead of panic selling. Carl Jensen called it at a cooperative meeting in December. 23 farms in our network, 0 foreclosures. Surrounding counties lost 9 farms to bankruptcy in 3 months. That's the difference between community and isolation. Bates stood in the back of the meeting hall listening to farmers share stories of near misses and close calls and financial terror that kept them awake at 3 in the morning. Listening to the same fear she felt, the knowledge that they were all operating on thin margins and one more shock could break them. But they hadn't broken. Not in the 1993 drought, not in the Western Prairie legal battle, not in the 2008 financial crash. They'd survived because they'd built something bigger than individual farms. They'd built a network that distributed risk and shared resources and turned 23 vulnerable operations into one resilient system. That was Deck's real legacy. Not the land he'd farmed or the battles he'd fought, but the example he'd set. The understanding that standing together mattered more than standing alone. That community was the only viable defense against forces too large for individuals to resist. Spring 2009 brought wheat prices back to $5.90, not great but survivable. The cooperative sold half its stored grain, locked in revenue that covered operating costs for member farms, held the remaining grain betting on further recovery. By June, prices hit $6.40 and they sold the rest. Bates Farm cleared $47,000 for the year after all expenses. Modest profit, but better than the losses other farmers were reporting. The cooperative model had worked. They'd survived the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression and come out intact. That summer, Bates formalized the hiring philosophy that had been developing since she'd become owner. Every applicant who came looking for work got asked the same question Deck had asked her 18 years ago. Not the exact words, but the same concept. What are you willing to fight for? The question separated people who wanted a job from people who wanted a purpose. Separated those who would quit when farming got hard from those who would persist, because persistence was the only option. Over the next decade, Bates hired 14 people using that question. 12 stayed long-term. 86% retention in an industry where 50% was normal. The first hire was Marcus Webb, 27 years old, Iraq veteran with PTSD so severe he couldn't hold civilian employment for more than 3 months before panic attacks forced him to quit. He came to the farm in 2009 with a resume that showed 6 jobs in 2 years, each ending badly, and a VA disability rating that said he was unemployable. Bates interviewed him in the farmhouse kitchen, same table where Deck had interviewed her, same coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in 1950. Marcus sat across from her, shaking slightly, hands clasped tight to control tremors, eyes that darted to windows and doors cataloging exits. "You've got PTSD." Bates kept her voice calm, stating fact, not judgment. "Yes, ma'am," Iraq, 2007. IED took out our convoy. I was the only survivor. Can't handle crowds or loud noises or unexpected movement. Makes me pretty useless for normal work. Farming isn't normal work, and PTSD doesn't make you useless, makes you cautious, aware. Good traits for someone operating heavy equipment. She leaned forward. I'm going to ask you a question and I need an honest answer. When farming gets hard, and it will get very hard, when equipment breaks and weather doesn't cooperate and markets crash, and you're working 20-hour days and everything hurts, what's going to keep you fighting? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Finally spoke, voice rough. I need to prove I'm not broken. VA says I'm unemployable. My family thinks I'm damaged goods. I need to prove I can still do hard things, that I'm still worth something. You're worth something right now. Being a veteran means you already proved you can do hard things. But I'm asking what will keep you here when it gets difficult. I don't quit. In Iraq, I could have quit when the convoy got hit. Could have frozen. Could have given up. I didn't. That's who I am. I don't quit. Bate hired him at $14 per hour, gave him equipment operation duties that played to his mechanical skills, assigned him to solo work in fields where crowds and noise weren't issues. Marcus stayed for 11 years, became equipment manager in 2015, earned 5% ownership stake through performance, proved the VA wrong about unemployability. The pattern repeated. Bate hired Susan Kowalski in 2011, 51 years old, divorced with no recent work experience, daughter of Rita Kowalski who'd sold her farm to Western Prairie in 1991. Susan had been rejected by 7 employers in Glendive before trying the farm. Bate asked the question. Susan answered honestly. I need to prove I can support myself, that I'm not dependent on anyone, that I can build something my mother couldn't. She stayed 9 years, became bookkeeper, managed all financial records with precision that impressed accountants, earned 3% ownership. Bate hired David Chen in 2012, 34 years old, factory worker laid off when the plant closed, no farming background, desperate for work in an economy still recovering from the crash. What are you willing to fight for? David answered, my family, my dignity, the right to work with my hands and make something real instead of assembling parts for minimum wage. He stayed 8 years, managed the cattle operation, proved that factory workers could learn farming if they wanted it badly enough, earned 4% ownership. Over and over the same pattern. People who'd been rejected elsewhere, people without credentials or recent experience or traditional qualifications, people who answered the question honestly and proved through work that determination mattered more than background. By 2015, the farm employed 16 people full-time. 12 of them had been hired using Deck's question. Ownership was distributed among 8 people who'd earned stakes through years of performance. Bate retained 40%, Kyle had 20%, the rest split among workers who'd proven their commitment. The distributed ownership model created loyalty that wages alone couldn't buy. Everyone had skin in the game. Everyone benefited from good years and felt the pain of bad years. Everyone fought for the farm's success because the farm's success was their success. Jackson graduated Montana State in 2000 with a degree in agricultural economics, 24 years old, smart and capable and interested in farming, but not in the way Bate had expected. He didn't want to operate equipment or manage cattle or work fields. He wanted policy work. He took a job with the USDA analyzing agricultural programs and their impacts on family farms. Bate supported it completely, the same way Deck had eventually supported Kyle choosing engineering over farming. You pick your path. I'm proud of you regardless. But Jackson's policy work fed back into the farm in unexpected ways. He understood subsidies and crop insurance and conservation programs better than anyone Bate knew. He helped the cooperative navigate federal programs that provided support for small farms, helped write grant applications that brought funding for equipment upgrades and soil conservation, contributed to the operation from Washington, D.C. in ways that mattered even though he never drove a tractor. Emma graduated Colorado State Veterinary School in 2009, 26 years old, brilliant and passionate about large animal medicine. She opened a practice in Glendive serving farms throughout Dawson County, became the farm's veterinarian, managing cattle health and breeding programs, married Lucas Reed in 2011, one of the seasonal workers who'd been elevated to part owner, creating family connections that tied the farm to the community in ways that went beyond business. Beth watched her children build lives that intersected with farming without being consumed by it and understood that this was legacy too, not just passing on land but passing on values, work ethic, community focus, the understanding that what you did mattered more than what you owned. The years between 2010 and 2020 were the consolidation years. Beth paid off the final debt to Sarah in 2010, 17 years after taking the loan, paid off her house mortgage in 2012, owned everything free and clear for the first time since buying partnership from DEC in 1994. The feeling was strange, almost unsettling. Decades of debt had become normal. Operating without it felt like flying without instruments. She used the debt-free status to expand carefully, leased another 400 acres in 2013, bought neighboring property in 2016 when the owner retired, 320 acres that brought the operation to 2,220 total. Revenue grew, profits accumulated. By 2018, the farm was grossing $450,000 annually, netting $120 to $150 depending on commodity prices. Beth's 40% ownership meant she was clearing $50,000 to $60,000 per year from profit share plus her management salary of $48,000. Total income around $100,000. More money than she'd imagined making when she'd had $67 and 6 rejections in 1991. She'd built wealth not through luck or inheritance or special advantages, but through 27 years of showing up and working hard and refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. Through accepting help when it was offered and offering help when others needed it. Through believing DEC when he said she could do this even when she didn't believe it herself. In 2013, Beth established the Decker Question Fund with a $180,000 endowment from farm profits accumulated over 5 years. The fund's purpose was simple: help aspiring farmers without traditional backgrounds get started in agriculture. Provide grants of $10,000 to $25,000, not loans. Offer mentorship through the Montana Veterans Agriculture Cooperative. Give access to equipment and land through partnership arrangements with member farms. The only requirement for applicants was that they had to answer DEC's question in a face-to-face interview. What are you willing to fight for? The fund helped 14 people between 2013 and 2020. 11 were still farming successfully as of 2020. 79% success rate for people who started with zero experience and no family farm background. The fund proved what Beth had learned from DEC and what she'd spent 27 years demonstrating. Experience mattered less than determination. Credentials mattered less than character. The willingness to fight for something you believed in mattered more than any advantage circumstances provided. Stories spread through Montana agriculture about the Decker farm and the Question Fund, and the woman who'd gone from combat medic to farm owner through sheer refusal to give up. Young people heard those stories and applied to the fund. Veterans heard those stories and came looking for work. The cooperative heard those stories and grew to 31 farms by 2018, 27,000 acres combined, the largest family farm network in eastern Montana. Western Prairie Consolidated still operated in the region, but their expansion had stalled. The cooperative farms presented a unified front that made individual acquisitions difficult. Legal harassment tactics had been exposed and shut down by court precedent. The price premium strategy had failed because cooperative farms could afford to hold grain and wait for better markets. By 2015, Western Prairie had shifted focus to other states where resistance was weaker. Bate had won, not through defeating Western Prairie in direct confrontation, but through building something too strong to break. Through creating a network that distributed risk and shared resources and turned vulnerable individual farms into a resilient collective system. That was the real victory, not keeping Western Prairie out but building something better than what they offered, proving that family farms could compete if they worked together, demonstrating that community mattered more than consolidation. September 2020 arrived in Dawson County, with weather that felt like every September Bate had experienced in 29 years of farming. The wheat fields turned golden under sun that made them glow like they were lit from within. The harvest was projected at 85,000 bushels from 2,220 acres, yield slightly above average because weather had cooperated and soil health had improved through decades of careful management. Bate was 66 years old now, her hair completely gray, face weathered by 6 decades of Montana sun and wind, body still strong from physical work, but showing its age in joints that ached in cold weather and a back that protested after long days on equipment. She'd started transitioning management responsibilities to Kyle and the other part owners, stepping back gradually the way Deck had stepped back when his health failed. But she still walked the fields every morning, checking crop conditions with an eye trained by 29 years of practice, still made the major strategic decisions, still interviewed every new applicant personally to ask the question. The Decker Farm September Gathering had become tradition, an annual event where current and former employees and fund recipients and cooperative members gathered to celebrate harvest and share stories, and remember the man who'd started it all. 120 people showed up in 2020, filling the machine shed that had been expanded twice to accommodate growth, sitting on hay bales and folding chairs and standing along the walls. Bate stood at the front of the room, same spot where she'd stood for 19 years running this gathering, looking at faces young and old, veterans from 4 wars, farmers who'd been working the land for decades and farmers who'd started 3 years ago with a Decker Fund grant. Deck asked me a question in September 1991. Her voice was strong, carried easily across the room even without a microphone. I'd been rejected by 6 employers, had $67 in my wallet, 2 kids depending on me, 9 days until eviction. I was desperate and I had no options. She paused, letting that sink in. Deck didn't ask if I had farming experience. He knew I didn't. He didn't ask if I had credentials or references or any of the things employers normally care about. He asked one question. What are you willing to fight for? I said my kids. I meant it. And I kept fighting for them through drought and financial crashes and legal battles and every hard thing that farming throws at you. But somewhere along the way the answer got bigger. I was fighting for this community, for family farms, for the idea that ordinary people could build something that mattered. She looked around the room. Everyone in this room is here because someone asked you that question or a version of it, because someone gave you a chance when you needed one. Marcus Webb, Deck gave you a chance even though PTSD made other employers write you off. Susan Kowalski, I gave you a chance even though you had no work experience at 51. David Chen, we gave you a chance even though factories closing put you on the street. Bates' voice strengthened. The 14 Decker Fund recipients in this room, we gave you grants and mentorship and land access not because you came from farming families, but because you answered the question honestly. You said what you were willing to fight for, and then you proved it through work. She paused again, emotion tightening her throat. Deck died 25 years ago, but his question lives on. Every person I hire gets asked. Every fund applicant gets asked. Because that question cuts through everything that doesn't matter and gets to the only thing that does. Will you fight when it gets hard? The room was completely silent. Bates saw tears on faces young and old, people who understood that they were part of something bigger than individual success. We've built something here. 29 years since Deck hired me, 25 years since he died, 31 farms in the cooperative, 263 people employed across those farms, 14 fund recipients farming successfully. We didn't just survive Western Prairie, we built something better than what they offered. Her voice broke slightly, but she kept going. Legacy isn't land or equipment or money in the bank. Legacy is what you pass on to people who come after you. Deck passed on the belief that determination matters more than experience, that community matters more than competition, that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible. She looked at Kyle standing to the side, gray in his own hair now, 23 years removed from the mistake that had nearly cost him his relationship with his father. Looked at Marcus Webb, who'd gone from unemployable veteran to equipment manager. Looked at the 14 fund recipients who'd started with nothing and built farms through sheer refusal to quit. I'm 66 years old. I've been farming 29 years. I started with $67 and ended with 2,220 acres owned free and clear. But the acres aren't the victory. The victory is you. Everyone in this room who believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they didn't quit. She stepped back. That's Deck's legacy. That's what survives. The room erupted in applause that lasted 3 minutes. Bates stood there feeling the weight of 29 years and the satisfaction of knowing she'd kept her promise to Deck. She'd kept the farm operating. She'd taught others. She'd fought for the same things he'd fought for. And she'd won. October brought a new applicant. Tommy Rodriguez, 23 years old, Marine Corps veteran, Afghanistan, honorable discharge 6 months ago, looking for work because civilian employment felt hollow after 4 years of military service and 2 combat deployments. He'd been rejected by 3 employers in Glendive, told he was overqualified or underqualified, or just wrong for positions that didn't require the skills he developed keeping vehicles running in Helmand Province. Bate interviewed him in the farmhouse kitchen, same table where Deck had interviewed her 29 years ago, where she'd interviewed 14 other people who'd needed chances. Tommy sat across from her wearing his best attempt at civilian clothes, jeans and a button shirt, hands that couldn't quite stay still, eyes that assessed the room the way combat veterans assessed every space they entered. Your prior service, Bate stated it as fact, not question. Yes, ma'am. Marines 2016 to 2020. Motor transport, 2 deployments Afghanistan. Mechanic mostly, some convoy security. Know anything about farming? No, ma'am. Why are you applying here? Tommy looked at his hands, gathering words. I've been out 6 months, tried 3 jobs. Warehouse work, retail, delivery, driving. All of it felt like I was just waiting for something to start. Like I was in between deployments instead of actually building a life. I need work that matters, work that's hard, work where I'm part of something bigger than myself. He looked up, met her eyes. I heard stories about this place, about a woman who hired veterans who couldn't get hired anywhere else, about a farm that gives people chances. Thought maybe that could be me. Bate poured coffee, same ritual Deck had performed 29 years ago. Let me tell you something about farming. It's not romantic, it's not easy. Equipment breaks at midnight. Weather destroys crops you spent 6 months growing. Markets crash and wipe out profit you were counting on. You'll work 20-hour days during harvest and still feel behind. Your back will hurt. Your hands will blister. You'll be too tired to eat and too wired to sleep. She paused. And some days you'll wonder why you're doing this, Why you're fighting weather and equipment and markets and all the other things trying to make you fail. On those days, the only thing that matters is having an answer to one question. Bate leaned forward. What are you willing to fight for? Tommy didn't hesitate. I'm willing to fight to prove I'm still useful, that I can build something instead of just waiting for orders, that I can be part of a team that matters. Marines taught me how to work hard and not quit and take care of the people beside me. I want to use that for something real. Bate studied him, seeing herself at 37, seeing every veteran she'd hired who needed a second chance, seeing Deck's faith in her reflected back. You start Monday. $14 an hour to start, 50 hours a week. You work hard, you learn fast, you prove yourself. There's ownership stake available down the road. But you have to earn it. Nothing gets handed out. Tommy's face showed relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. Yes, ma'am. I'll earn it. Monday, 5:30 a.m. Don't be late. After Tommy left, Bates sat at the kitchen table looking at the place where 29 years ago she'd sat across from Deck with $67 and no options and a desperate need for someone to believe in her. The farmhouse was quiet except for the clock on the wall that had been ticking since 1950, and the wind outside that sounded like every wind that had ever blown across 840 acres of Montana wheat land. She thought about Deck asking the question, about her answer, about 29 years of fighting for something she believed in, about building a farm and a community and a legacy that would outlive her. The question had changed her life, had changed Marcus Webb's life and Susan Kowalski's life and David Chen's life and 14 Decker Fund recipients' lives, and now Tommy Rodriguez's life. Had changed the lives of every person who'd been given a chance because someone believed that determination mattered more than credentials. That was the power of one question asked by the right person at the right time to someone who needed to hear it. The power of believing in people when they didn't believe in themselves. The power of giving chances to those who'd been told they weren't good enough or qualified enough or experienced enough. Deck had given her that chance. She'd kept it alive for 29 years. And now Tommy Rodriguez would carry it forward, would prove himself through work, would maybe become an owner someday, would maybe ask the question to someone else who needed to hear it. The legacy continued, not through land or money, but through the question and the chances it created and the lives it changed. Bates stood up, walked to the window, looked out at wheat fields ready for harvest. The same fields Deck had shown her in 1991 when she didn't know wheat from corn. The same land his great-grandfather had broken in 1887 with an ox team and determination. 4 generations of Deckers followed by Beth Morgan, who wasn't a Decker by blood, but was one by choice and work and refusal to quit. And after her, there would be others. Kyle and the part owners and the fund recipients and maybe Tommy Rodriguez if he proved himself. The farm would continue not because one person owned it but because a community believed in it and fought for it and passed it on to those who came after. That was what Deck had understood. That was what he'd taught her. That was what she'd spent 29 years proving. Legacy wasn't land. Legacy was the question. What are you willing to fight for? Bate had answered that question in 1991, with $67 and 2 kids and 9 days until eviction. She'd been answering it every day since. And she'd keep answering it until the day she couldn't answer anymore. Because some things were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible, especially when the fight seemed impossible. The farm, the community, the veterans who needed chances, the ordinary people who could do extraordinary things if someone just believed in them. That was worth fighting for. That was worth everything.